355. Interlude. Welcome to CraftLit, the podcast for crafters who love books. I'm your host, Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania. Episode 355, Poetic Interlude. Well, hello. We've had a bit of a departure for this week. Instead of our regularly scheduled chapter of Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South, today we have a poetic interlude. This was born of necessity because Barbara Edelman, our incredibly generous book reader, has been ill and has had no voice with which to speak. So instead, I was thinking about something I said a few weeks ago about poetry and how much poetry has frustrated me in my own life, which is difficult when you're an English teacher. But also, I've been thinking a lot about teaching in general and how poetry is taught. And I guess it must have been drifting around my husband's mind as well, because he just released a blog post for work on the importance of poetry and metaphor and being able to understand these things as adults and as members of society and as people who have inherited a long, long history of poems and poetry and figurative language and irony and metaphor. And that was all well and good, but there was not enough time in the universe for me to do all the research it would take for me to do an absolutely poem-filled episode. So I was stuck and didn't know what to do. So I woke up Tuesday morning and realized I had a solution to this problem sitting in the same room with me. I put a microphone in between my husband, Andrew Ordover, and me, and we talked about poetry. And because he was an English major and because he reads poetry, he mentions quite a few poems. So under fair use educational copyright, I have included in here audio recordings of some of the poems that he mentions. I've put links to all of the poems that he mentions in the show notes for this episode. And I've put a link to the Catapult Learning blog where you can find his blog post. There are a few poems he mentions in this episode, but there's a lot more going on over at the blog. So for listeners who are new, welcome. We are 2/3 of the way through Elizabeth Gaskell's book, North and South, and we will return to that scheduled programming next week. For those of you who are longtime listeners, there will be no crafty content today except the craft of poetry. And I will divulge my frustration and suffering at the hands of poetry my entire life. But actually, the things that Andrew mentioned that I had to go and find, I really like them. So now I'm kind of intrigued and I have some new ideas. We don't have any solutions, but we do have lots of ideas, and I know that you will have ideas as well. Don't forget, we have a new listener call-in line. You can leave an audio message that I can receive as an MP3 file and play in a future episode. That phone number is 206-350-1642. That number is programmed into the CraftLit app, meaning that from the Android, Windows, or iOS app, as long as it is a phone and not a tablet, you can tap contact and the phone number will be one of those options. We also have the phone number listed at the top of the show notes. And as always, you can also leave comments at the show notes at craftlit.com, episode 355. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I will now turn you over to the conversation I had with Andrew, beginning with my confession that I really don't like poetry all that much. I'm lousy at poetry, but you sent me poetry and I married you.
Right, so you must not hate it that much.
I think it comes down to I don't hate the poetry that you send me, but that might be because I pay more attention to it.
Well, I don't love all poetry. There's plenty of stuff I don't like.
Is there an era you don't like? Or a style you don't like?
I think the poetry that I've always liked is like it for the same reasons I like songs, because the things that I've always written, they were stories or plays or novels, now are always huge, long, cumbersome, ridiculous things. And I've always admired, a song lyric or a poem that can crystallize something really quickly and condense something into a line or two that someone like me would have needed pages to get anywhere near. So I think I don't like very long poems for that reason. I kind of like the short ones. But aside from just length, I think I like the poems that have more dense imagery, where it's not as narrative or ballad-like. And I guess that's why I didn't like the Romantics and Wordsworth and people like that who just sort of went on for pages and pages. But I liked Dylan Thomas and E. Cummings, and I liked the poems that, as I said, it's dense, and it just kind of hits you over the head with something strange and kind of ineffable. I think that's the word I was thinking of earlier today when I knew you were going to make me do this. And what do I mean by that? I mean, the things that make it fun as a poem for me are when it says something in a way that nothing else but that image and that poem could say it. And not only that it says it, but that it's trying to say it can't really say in a way. The power of the image is that it's so visceral and weird in a way, in the way that it paints a picture for you that you can't translate it. I mean, if you had to explain it, you probably could. It would take you 5 times longer, and you still wouldn't do it right. You know what I mean? I think it's kind of like a joke. You can't really explain a joke. I mean, you can try, but you kill it. You actually kill the humor in the joke by trying to explain it. It only works when it gets that eruption of a laugh from you, but not you thinking through, oh, well, that's very clever. Because if you do think through it, you don't laugh. The laugh just happens. And I think the poems that I've loved the most have that kind of reaction, where there's something densely packed in the image that's almost beyond words in a way, that the image is just what it is, and it's beyond explanation. But there's something absolutely real and communicative in that thing, even though you can't touch it or explain your way around it.
I think the first time it happened a long time ago, but it was because of a conversation I had with you. But the most recent time that this happened to me was working on the curriculum where I used the Child's Christmas in Wales, the Dylan Thomas piece, that I was unfamiliar with. I hadn't read it when I was a child. I hadn't read it when I was in school. I had no relationship with it at all. But you had said, this is going to be great. It's going to be great for this age group, and it's going to be great for these reasons. And so I went ahead and used it. And it wasn't until I sat down with our boys and said, I need to practice this with human people before I write the lesson plan, because I have no idea what normal people are going to say or how they're going to respond to this poem until I talk through it. I remember reading through it with them the first time because we were practicing close reading and the whole technique of going through it multiple times for different reasons, not just to keep rereading the stupid thing over and over again. And the first time we got through it, and both boys said, oh, well, that's weird. And then we went through it slower, and this time chunking it and taking the first paragraph first, and both of them getting that look in their eyes, like they didn't have it yet, but they knew there was something more than what they got the first time.
And they knew there was something cool.
Yeah.
And I think that's the danger of close reading, is skipping that part.
Yeah.
Because if you don't let them have the experience, and I think you're right, with something really complex, their eyes might glaze over the first time. And I think you've got to get them to the point where they have their gasp, even if they don't really understand it. That thing underneath the understanding they get, where they go, oh, that's really cool. And then you can say, okay, now let's go through it and figure out why it's cool and what it's doing. And how did he write that to get this reaction from you? Maybe not what does it mean, because you may not get what does it mean. I think that's what kills poetry in school all the time is, and you get kids saying, well, it could mean anything you want it to mean. Well, no, I mean, it's open to interpretation, but it's not wide open. But being obsessed with what it means, I think, just drains it. It's more like, how did he do that to you? If it made you have that intake of air, or even just say, I don't get it, but it's cool, then I think the close reading is looking under the hood to see, you know, what made the engine go. And that's worth analyzing. And maybe some of what he's trying to do or what she's trying to do and what it means, or just when he puts this word up against that word, what does it do to you? But if you get there first and they don't enjoy it viscerally, there's no point to the whole thing. And but it doesn't matter what they're reading, you know, whether it's a novel or Winnie the Pooh or poetry. And I think we skip that part too often in school of giving them the experience of just loving it.
Right. Or not even loving it. But I remember one of those aha moments when I was teaching was doing the quotes, notes, and thoughts, and realizing that the thoughts weren't, I have this deep thought about Huckleberry Finn and how it relates to time and space and humanity and the human condition and Mark Twain's idealistic cynicism and all of that. That instead it was, you wrote this quote in your notes and you think you know why this quote is important, but you aren't positive. So you can write down that your thought is, I don't know why this is important, but it feels important. Something about this is speaking to me on a level that maybe I don't understand yet, but that might be because I'm 14. It might be because I just don't have enough yet to be able to put words to it.
And when I say loving it, I that's enough, right? Is feeling like there's something in there that you'd want to write on your wall.
Right. Yeah.
You know, like whether, I don't remember whether it's Seymour Glass or Buddy Glass or whichever one of the Glass brothers writes all the phrases on the wall, which I copied because I was a pretentious arty kid.
Which I fell in love with, so that was okay.
But, you know, it's taking ownership of that piece and saying, I want that. And I think it's okay to say, I don't know why I love that, but there's something in there that's clicking with me.
One Christmas was so much like the other in those years around the Seatown corner now, out of all sound except the distant speaking of the voices I sometimes hear a moment before sleep, that I can never remember whether it snowed for 6 days and 6 nights when I was 12, or whether it snowed for 12 days and 12 nights when I was 6. All the Christmases roll down towards the two-tongued sea like a cold and headlong moon bundling down the sky that was our street. And they stop at the rim of the ice-edged, fish-freezing waves, and I plunge my hands in the snow where I can find. In goes my hand into that wool-white, bell-tongued ball of holidays resting at the rim of the carol-singing sea. And out come Mrs. Prothero and the firemen.
And I think it's okay to say, I don't know why I love that, but there's something in there that's clicking with me.
How did you get there, though? I mean, did you have a teacher that gave you that permission? Did your parents do that for you? How did you get to that point? Because I never got there until I was married to you.
I don't have a clue. I think it's just reading and having been exposed to people who played with language as a kid. You know, whether it was in children's books. And I think one of the reasons other kids don't get it is that they read garbage. You know, if they're reading Walter the Farting Dog and SpongeBob knockoff books, and that's all they read as kids, they're not getting anyone who delights in language and does those things.
Like CDB or...
Yeah, CDB, very basic, or the 13 Clocks. You know, and having James Thurber read aloud to you, you can hear the poetry and the fun in the language. And if it's read to you a lot, you just get it by osmosis somehow. And so you do respond to it, or just singing nonsense songs or things like that. I know when Aaron was very little and I would sing to him, we just made up words sometimes and just played with language and played with sound. And I think if kids don't get any of that, there's no fun in it, and they don't see it later on when they see it. And I don't remember if there were any particular teachers who helped point that out, but I know there are poets like that I resonate with. Like, I like Dylan Thomas. I like what he does with language. And I think that's similar to why I liked Salman Rushdie and I liked Tom Robbins in fiction, because they love words in a similar way, and they'll take a word and peel it apart and turn it inside out and just play with it. And there are things in Dylan Thomas and Fern Hill that I love but I would hate as a teacher to be responsible for explaining every image. Because some of them are, like the Hay High Barn or something like that. They're pretty straightforward. But I sang in my chains like the sea. I don't know what that means. I know what it feels like. I kind of know what it means. But it doesn't literally mean anything. It feels like something, and it feels like something honest and real. You get that. But if I had to diagram it all and explain, like, this is exactly what he's saying about his childhood and childhood, I think, like a joke, it would just, vaporize, and it wouldn't be there anymore.
Did you feel like Dylan Thomas made more sense when you got to Tenby, to his writing Cottage on the Water?
No, as a person maybe, but not the words. You hear more Welsh spoken, you get the rhythm of it, but not the sense of it. The sense of it is just weirdly him.
Which is very cool, because that means you don't have to know necessarily all this history and weight and background.
I don't think to understand what Fern Hill means about childhood, you don't have to have a picture of where he grew up. Because then then you did a bad job with the poem, right? It doesn't say anything, but I think it says a lot to a kid growing up on Long Island. I mean, I didn't know anything about his childhood in Wales, but I love that poem.
Now as I was young and easy under the apple boughs about the lilting house, and happy as the grass was green, the night above the dingle starry, time let me hail and climb, golden in the heydays of his eyes. And honoured among wagons I was prince of the apple towns, and once below a time my lordly had the trees and leaves trail with daisies and barley down the rivers of the windfall light. And as I was green and carefree, famous among the barns about the happy yard, and singing as the farm was home, in the sun that is young once only, time let me play and be, golden in the mercy of his means.
Are the poems I tend to gravitate towards where there's something that just gets under my skin about the imagery, even if I can't nail it down. And you asked me to think about poems ahead of time, and one of them that I thought about was Paul Celan's poem, The Death Fugue, which is a Holocaust poem. And it's the only poem, it's really the only Holocaust literature I know of that feels like it's, again, like touching the ineffable, like getting to the thing you can't really ever say. It gets close to that. And yet I couldn't possibly parse out the images and tell you. The very first line is black milk of daybreak. I don't know what that means, but he repeats it over and over again. And there's something when you read or even chant, because it feels like you need to chant it, even the first stanza of it, even if you didn't know when it was written or what it was written about, you'd feel creeped out and you'd sort of know what it was about without it ever saying it's this country, it's these people. There's just something in there.
There have been a couple poems like that where I don't think I knew where it came from or the history of the person who wrote it, but it was one of those kind of like, oh. And then when you start to learn more, pieces click into place, but it doesn't necessarily change your reaction to the poem because the words are the words and they have that contact with your heart or with your soul or with the thing that makes meaning for you.
And it is like music, the same way that a song is the combination of the music and the lyrics. I think poetry is like that, good poetry. It has a rhythm to it. Even if it's a chant kind of poem like Death Fugue, for sure. But even Fern Hill has a lilting kind of rhythm, and you can't escape that. It's the images work with it.
You've mentioned Fern Hill a bunch now. How old were you, do you think, when you first came into contact with it?
It was either college or after.
Really? It was that late?
Yeah, because I don't think I read any. I mean, I didn't sit and read poetry books sitting under a tree. I encountered the same list of poems that are in every anthology when I was in high school and college. The E. Cummings I knew was that stuff. And then I bought the collected E. Cummings and I started thumbing through it, and I found all the other cool stuff that never got in, that wasn't the Goat-Footed Balloon Man or the Cambridge Ladies, but the other ones that I discovered. Thing with Dylan Thomas, I mean, I knew Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night, and I think maybe Death Shall Have No Dominion. There's some other There's, I think, one other Dylan Thomas that got anthologized, but I must have come across it either in college in a class or after.
What made you buy E.E. Cummings, The Collected Works?
It was Hannah and Her Sisters, the Woody Allen movie, because one of the poems gets read aloud.
Is that how you got me to marry you?
Yeah, well, I think that's the same poem. My limited imagination, I used the same one Michael Caine used. And the book that he buys for Barbara Hershey is the same book. But it must have happened before that, because I already had that book, because I knew when I saw the movie that he was citing the wrong page number, which I thought was brilliant insider knowledge, because I checked after I saw the movie. Like,
Did you really?
Why would they pick the wrong page number? He has the book. He knows what page it's on.
You were such a snarky intellectual already.
I don't know. But it's true. So I already had that book. I don't think I knew that poem before the movie, but I had the full collected books.
You'd have a good time. I know you would.
And don't forget the poem on page 112. It reminded me of you.
Really?
Page 112.
Bye.
Bye.
Your slightest look easily will unclose me. Though I have closed myself as fingers, you open always, petal by petal, myself, as spring opens, touching skillfully, mysteriously, her first rose. I do not know what it is about you that closes and opens. Only something in me understands. The voice of your eyes is deeper than all roses. Nobody, not even the rain, has such small hands.
After we got married, at some point, I sat down with that book when you were somewhere, probably at a rehearsal or something. And I thumbed through it and I realized that, I think that might have been one of those moments when I realized I know nothing. You know, this is a whole, I mean, I teach English, which means I have to teach poetry to a certain extent, but I stuck with the safe stuff. The stuff that I understood, which wasn't necessarily safe in the grand scheme of things, because to me, safe was Shakespeare and Molière and poetry that was theater poetry. That stuff I could do. And I could deal with rhyme, and I could deal with iambic pentameter, and I could even deal with imagery and metaphor. But when it got into stuff like Dylan Thomas and E.E. Cummings, I had no frame of reference for any of that. And I don't know if it's because I came from parents who are scientists.
I mean, I think it may have been that, and it's also that it's taught badly. I mean, it's taught like the Dead Poets Society textbook. And then I think you get two layers of dumbing down. You get the easy poems are the ones that get anthologized generally. And then the easiest of the easy poems are the ones the teachers bother to teach, because even the hard ones in the anthology, you know, so for E.E. Cummings, it's always the Cambridge Ladies, and it's always I Sing of Olaf. And it's always one of the Goat-Footed Balloon Man, or in one of the spring poems. And they'll never teach Olaf because it's long and it's hard and it's political. And they won't teach Cambridge Ladies because they don't understand it. So they teach the Goat-Footed Balloon Man. And they'll teach it because it's cute. And what they'll teach about it is, look how he doesn't capitalize, and look how he sprinkles words on the page. And why don't you try and write a poem where the words are sprinkled on the page? So, I mean, the anthology did have some of the tougher stuff, but not the really dense stuff. But even at that level, the teachers will end up editing themselves out of it.
Yeah.
And I think the same thing with Dylan Thomas. You know, Fernhill might have been in some of the anthologies, but the teachers wouldn't have come anywhere near it.
No.
But Do Not Go Gentle, they can teach. And they can say, this is a villanelle. Here's the structure of a villanelle.
Oh my God, you remembered it's a villanelle.
And, you know, and the message of it is pretty straightforward.
Yeah. Although then you look at something like Frost's, that every English teacher for the last 50 years has gotten wrong. Was that a New Yorker article that we read that went through and parsed the whole thing out and or was it Atlantic? It was probably the Atlantic. The whole point has been misunderstood by at least 2 generations of English teachers. And you know, it just perpetuates over and over again.
Well, I think it's very dangerous. I mean, it's your job as a teacher, you think, to try and explain everything. and define the world out of existence in a way. But I mean, if you say that's not what I'm going to do as a teacher, I think what I want is for my kids to have an experience of something. And then even get weirder and say, I want them to have an experience of something they can't quite explain. That's weird.
Well,
that's
and it's
weird,
hard to
dangerous
quantify.
territory. And that's almost like, that's what Sunday school's for.
Yeah. But it's also, I mean, if you're being held to standards, which, you know, we've had many conversations about standards. If you're being held to standards, that's very squishy territory because, well, how do I show that my students are capable of citing texts and discussing at a collegiate level how they don't understand?
Right. And that's why the standards won't ever talk about poetry. They never do. The most they ever do is talk about figurative language, and it'll say, understand figurative language. And what they'll say in the parentheses is, you know, alliteration, personification. So what they mean is define it and be able to point to something and say, that's personification. But what does it mean? They don't ask for that. And how does it make you feel? They'd say, that's none of our business. So it's purely definitional, which is as low level as you could get. Is, you know, that's a this, here's a thing, that's another thing, that's a noun, that's a verb.
But that's really interesting that you say that, because the minute you said personification, I just watched the video of me teaching the Zora Neale Hurston, which is the first page of Their Eyes Were Watching God. And it is as dense a piece of prose as any piece of poetry Dylan Thomas ever wrote. There is so much going on in that first page. And the kids were able to identify, here's personification, here's alliteration, here's extended metaphor, here's regular metaphor, here's imagery, and all of that stuff. I'm convinced, because they are born and raised above the Mason-Dixon line, to them it was lovely. And by the time they were done with it, all three of them came independently to me and said, I want to read that book now, which is huge for the kind of weird experiment that we were in. But I'm remembering back to teaching it in New York City, there was always a split between the kids who'd lived all their time in New York City and the kids who'd spent their summers in the South with their grandmothers. And the understanding, the visceral understanding of the text was completely different because of what they brought to the text.
Well, and because of the prettiness of the language, and because you only had an hour with them and it was only that first page, I think they responded to the prettiness of the language, but the ugliness of some of the visceral stuff that's in there, I think, went completely over their heads because it sounded beautiful.
Ships at a distance have every man's wish on board. For some, they come in with the tide. For others, they sail forever on the horizon, never out of sight, never landing, until the watcher turns his eyes away in resignation, his dreams mocked to death by time. That is the life of men. Now, women forget all those things they don't want to remember, and remember everything they don't want to forget. The dream is the truth. Then they act and do things accordingly. So the beginning of this was a woman, and she had come back from burying the dead. Not the dead of sick and ailing, with friends at the pillow and the feet. She had come back from the sodden and the bloated, the sudden dead, their eyes flung wide open in judgment. The people all saw her come, because it was sundown. The sun was gone, but he had left his footprints in the sky. It was the time for sitting on porches beside the road. It was the time to hear things and talk. These sitters had been tongueless, earless, eyeless conveniences all day long. Mules and other brutes had occupied their skins. But now the sun and the boss man were gone, so the skins felt powerful and human. They became lords of sounds and lesser things. They passed nations through their mouths. They sat in judgment. Seeing the woman as she was made them remember the envy they had stored up from other times, so they chewed up the back parts of their minds and swallowed with relish. They made burning statements with questions and killing tools out of laughs. It was mass cruelty. a mood come alive. Words walking without masters, walking all together like harmony in a
prettiness
song.
of the language, and because you only had an hour with them and it was only that first page, I think they responded to the prettiness of the language, but the ugliness of some of the visceral stuff that's in there, I think, went completely over their heads because it sounded beautiful. And again, I think that's what teachers hide from. So I don't remember, but I know I read The Cambridge Ladies again, going back to that one. I know I read that in high school. And I guarantee you the teacher went through the first 2/3 of it or 3/4 of it, because it's very straightforward. The imagery is fun and cool, and it's snarky, and it says what it says, and it's not hard. Right? The Cambridge ladies who live in furnished souls
are unbeautiful and have comfortable minds. Also, with the church's Protestant blessings, daughters, unscented, shapeless, spirited. They believe in Christ and Longfellow, both dead, are invariably interested in so many things. At the present writing, one still finds delighted fingers knitting for the, is it poles?
That's cool. Perhaps. Are unbeautiful and have comfortable minds. Great. We can talk about that.
For days.
For days, right? And it all the way through. And then you get to the last piece of it, and the last line or two, it goes into some weird religious judgmental thing. Maybe religious, maybe not. But I don't remember us ever talking about that. And that's the part where it veers off into, I kind of know what that means, but what does it really mean? And
But that's dangerous territory for teachers to get into, right?
And that's the problem with good poems, is that they're always going to be talking about real stuff that nobody wants to talk about. So the last piece of it is, the Cambridge ladies do not care above Cambridge if sometimes in its box of sky, lavender and cornerless, the moon rattles like a fragment of angry candy. So, I mean, and that's a separate weird little...
Oh, it is.
There's 4 dots, like mega ellipsis, that separates it from the rest of the poem.
Right.
And all the rest of the poem is just the snarky little, the rich well-bred ladies are soulless and superficial.
So it's this coda.
And then the coda of it suddenly goes to this other place of celestial judgment. And, it's pulls way, way back. Suddenly you're in the sky, this cornerless, empty, weird sky, and the moon is rattling like a piece of angry candy. But we never talked about that. And why is it angry candy, and why is it the moon, and is that God, or is that the whole universe? And what is it saying about superficial people? We didn't go there. And I don't know that there are answers to those things, other than, I don't know, when it says the moon, what does it feel like? It's both close and not close. I don't know. And why is it a cornerless sky? And why angry and candy go together interestingly. But we never talked about that because that's harder. And that's, I think, one of the places where teachers would also say, well, it could mean anything. So how I can't teach that. But whereas furnished souls I know exactly what to say about that. But the moon rattling like a piece of angry candy, I'm not sure.
But it can't mean anything. It can't mean hot dogs.
No, I know that.
It can't. And I think that's where...
But if they don't know exactly what it means...
Yeah, well, that's where we get scared.
Or they're afraid to open up a conversation and get 3 kids disagreeing with each other, and they don't know how to corral that, or whether it's okay. Or are they just ineffective teachers if they say, well, those are interesting, and I don't know.
Well, I think that one of the things that was so freeing when I left teaching in California and started teaching in New York was that I think it must have been when you were teaching in Eastside. And so there's this whole metaphor exercise where you get kids to recognize that a simile is a specific limited thing, and a metaphor is an expansive, non-exclusive thing, that it can mean all the things, and that it's your relationship with the text as well as the author's relationship with the text, as well as, in some cases, your relationship with the author and what you know about the author, that brings meaning to it for you as a reader. And so if that's true, and I think it is, then it frees the teacher up to be able to say, okay, go back to the text. Why do you think it's a hot dog? What is it about this moon thing rattling like a piece of candy that makes you think hot dog?
Right.
And you get the kid to start talking about it, and then they have something to write about.
That's getting under the hood that we talked about, right? Is don't obsess about what it has to mean, but what does it feel like, and what did he do to get you to feel like that?
Mm-hmm.
And maybe even like, why did he break it there? Why is it 4 ellipses?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it feels like he's separate. He's separating it. He's pulling back. Okay, that's interesting. So the perspective changed. And why do you think he did that? I don't think it has to define everything and diagram it like a sentence.
Mm-hmm.
But I think you can analyze it. And, is it the imagery? Is it the rhythm?
Mm-hmm.
Does the rhythm change here? Why? And in that Holocaust poem, why is it this weird lilting chant kind of thing?
Mm.
If you're talking about something that ugly, what does it do? And I copied it so I could read a little bit of it. And I'm just going to cut it in the middle of a stanza because it doesn't ever stop. Black milk of daybreak, we drink it at evening. We drink it at midday and morning. We drink it at night. We drink and we drink. We shovel a grave in the air. That's 3.5 lines.
Wow.
I'll do more of it so you can just hear it goes on. We shovel a grave in the air. There you won't lie too cramped. A man lives in the house. He plays with his vipers. He writes. He writes when it grows dark to Deutschland, your golden hair, Marguerite. He writes it and steps out of doors, and the stars are all sparkling. He whistles his hounds to come close. He whistles his Jews into rows, has them shovel a grave in the ground. He orders us to strike up and play for the dance.
Holy crud. When was that written?
I don't know. It's Paul Celan, Celan. I think it's late 40s or in the 50s. I know, so it's got this weird chant. If you look at it on the page, there's no punctuation. The words just go and go and go until you get to the end of the stanza. And then the next stanza is almost a complete repeat. It starts exactly the same way, except black milk of daybreak, we drink it at evening. He says, black milk of evening, we drink you at evening. And then he switches. Instead of golden hair Marguerite, it's ashen hair Shulamith. And so you've got the golden haired Marguerite and the ashen haired Shulamith going back and forth, and more words get translated into German as it goes on. I think that may depend on the translation of the poem. But, I don't know what any of that means literally. And I think, again, if you try and pull it apart and say this means that, it just falls apart. But there's something in the driving force that, he called it a fugue. And it does kind of just drive and then fold in on itself and repeat with variations. And there's something mesmerizing and hypnotic and creepy about it. And the creepiness sneaks up on you because suddenly we're talking about vipers, and then he whistles his hounds, and then he whistles his Jews, and then suddenly the hounds don't seem so nice anymore. And we dig a grave in the air, but then they're digging a grave in the ground. And I think you have to let it have its effect. And then you can talk about the effect more than the meaning, the feeling.
It almost seems like if I had had a way to teach poetry effectively when I was younger, which I don't think I had, I actually think that it helps to have some age on you in order to deal with this stuff when you're teaching. It's almost like you want that to be the last thing they hear before they walk out of the room. And no commentary from you. It's just you end that poem, the bell rings, you say, I'll see you tomorrow, and they walk out the door. So that when they walk in the next morning, you're able to say, so what did you think about that poem yesterday? Because then they've had 24 hours to process. And certainly with a poem like that, I would think that would be helpful to have.
Well, I think
time.
That's one of the nice things about close reading too, is if teachers learn nothing about close reading except it's all about rereading, like they need to read it 3 times, 4 times.
Well, then that makes what we do on the podcast make that much more sense, because so many people who listen to the podcast say, well, I read this book when I was in high school, but I got so much more out of it now. It's like, well, this is your second time through.
Well, and hearing it read to you is very different, because I remember when I was teaching in a school for kids with learning disabilities and drug problems and all sorts of problems. And we always had the kids read aloud to us because we could pick up some of their reading issues if we heard them read.
And this was one-on-one?
One-on-one. And I had a girl read all of The Great Gatsby aloud to me. And I had another girl read Heart of Darkness aloud. And I appreciated those books in very different ways than I'd ever appreciated them before, just because I couldn't skim. When you're reading and you're skimming, like, I get the big idea. But when you're listening to it, you kind of have to linger on every word and let the words, each one have their impact and the rhythm of it. And you can't really skim when you're being read to.
And those are 2 books where skimming would be brutally, brutally wrong.
Well, and again, I think that's why there are so many kids who come out of school hating all this literature, because all the teacher will talk about is like what happened.
Mm.
And if all you care about with Great Gatsby is what happened in chapter 3, then there's no point in reading it. You might as well read the Cliff Notes, because the plot is ludicrous, right? There's nothing to it. It's tiny and it's trite. And that's not the point. But if you don't know what to do with it except summarize it, then they're not going to get anything out of it.
What was your favorite part of The Great Gatsby?
There were times where the scene with the shirts I loved. And there were times where the very ending I loved. And then just before it, when he talks about the fresh green breast of the new world being corrupted, and that's what spoke to me and got to me.
That's cool that it changes, that it moves as you change and move through life. I mean, I felt that way. I don't know why I don't allow that to happen anymore, because I know, and I've used the examples before, that the Phantom Tollbooth and The Little Prince, very different books. I had incredibly different understandings of those books depending on when I read them. And I read them over and over again. And I imagine I read them over and over again because every time I did, it said something different to me.
Well, and there are so many books we read when we're teenagers that we have no access to because they're about grown-up things. You know, I think there were times where I reread The Great Gatsby and the kind of mournful adultness of Nick looking back and being the kind of conservative adult, having very mixed feelings about the wild craziness. Reading that at 16 is very different from reading it at 36, even 26.
And not just wild craziness, but the wild craziness attached to Gatsby, this tragic.
And the waste and destructiveness, but also the romantic, you know, all of that stuff. You kind of need to be more of an adult. And even Catcher in the Rye, which is completely a teenage book, I remember reading it again when I was teaching it. And suddenly I felt really sorry for his teacher, Mr. Antolini.
Oh, God. Yeah.
Because there I was, a teacher reaching out to troubled teenagers, and there he was blowing it and missing his chance.
And not only that, but misunderstanding Mr. Antolini.
Right.
Completely.
And them both misunderstanding each other.
I remember that. Well, I hated Catcher in the Rye when I read it when I was 17. I thought he was a whiner and an idiot. And then I went back and read it again when I was teaching it. So I was 28 or 29 when I did that. It was a completely different book. I
didn't even get, the one good thing about books in high school is that they come kind of pre-symbolized for you. Like, here's To Kill a Mockingbird. Guess what the central metaphor is going to be? Here's Lord of the Flies. Here's Catcher in the Rye. It's
Animal
great.
Farm. Yep.
It's all right there for you. They put it in the title. It's going to be important. And yet I have no memory of talking about the image of the Catcher in the Rye when I was reading it in school. And that was one of my favorite high school teachers. And it wasn't until I was teaching it and going through it again that jumped out at me, which it never did when I was a kid. And that image of him in the field trying to catch the kids, and how that connected to the image of the carousel, and watching his sister go around and around and around, and why that's the moment of his breakdown. Like, oh, it all comes together now. And I could really teach it then and point those things out and get that's cool aha moments from the kids. Because that's when the symbolism and the imagery really connected with them and connected with the whole story. There's the whole story in one. If you had to paint one picture that tells you what the story's about, there it is.
And so is the fact that you were able to take a 36-year-old reaction to and understanding of a text that you had completely non-understood when you were their age, is your ability to have done that just that you're a super genius, or did it have something to do with storytelling? And because we've talked about this before, that teachers aren't taught how to tell stories. Because it seems to me that every single one of my English teachers, with the possible exception of one, had their own relationship with the text, but that they were entirely incapable of communicating that passion or that understanding or that excitement to their students, where I feel as though you and I have had an easier time doing that. And the only thing we've got going for us is theater background.
Yeah, I think that helps. And the theater background, I mean, theater is strange because, the real stories is taking place in their heads in the audience.
Is it just that we're comfortable with that being?
I think it's comfort with that. And I think maybe it's being less didactic about telling you what the story means or what I like about the story. And I mean, I know I've probably failed a lot, but I think I've tried to pull back from that point and think of it more like the synapse and the nerve endings, just bring the two things close together and let the electricity jump, because that's where the fun is, rather than smushing them together and saying, this is that.
So you get that gasp, that moment of the jump where the kids go,
but they can't get that if you connect all the dots for them. You just got to bring them close enough that the static electricity is there. You've got to explain it enough that they can take that step themselves and do the work themselves. And then they own it because they've made a connection you can't.
Right.
But if you're making the connection, I had a visiting professor in college who was from Alabama, I think. And we were reading some T.S. Eliot poem, and every connection he had to it was from growing up in rural Alabama, which was fine for him, but it had nothing to do with me. And I got very angry because as far as I was concerned, it had nothing to do with T.S. Eliot either. But, he owned it. Right. That was his T.S. Eliot, and he had a right to it, but it left me completely in the cold. And it didn't leave me room to make it my own, because that was the interpretation he wanted and he had, and I was supposed to acknowledge it and respond to it. Yeah. And so it's just like explaining the joke. Like when we're trying to help our kids tell jokes well, don't explain it to death. You've just got to let it sit. And if you told it well, you got to laugh. And if you don't, you don't. But kind of like a magic trick. I mean, you can't do it twice. And if it didn't work, you just got to move on, because all you're going to do is kill it.
It's so interesting because while you were talking about that professor, the phrase sage on the stage popped into my mind. And I realize now why that has become such a bugaboo in the ed world, that there's the coach on the side and the sage on the stage. And you don't want to be the sage you want to be the coach, which is not true. You have to have somebody who can be up in front of you, who knows something more than you do, who can help you get to where you want to go. But the difference is a sage on the stage, if they're a real sage, would be raising questions and allowing you to come up with your own answers. Whereas a didact would be telling you what the answer is. Right. And it's not the sage on the stage that's the problem. It's the didact.
And Yoda is a sage, and he leaves plenty of room for Luke to figure things out.
And not only to figure things out, but be wrong.
But he gives him a pathway, and he hints, and he lets him be wrong and work his way to the solution, because he knows he can't do it for him. And
he has to let Luke own it. When he gets there, Luke has to believe he got there on his own.
Yeah, so I agree. There's nothing wrong with being a sage. But Yoda's 900 years old. Our teachers are 25. I mean, I think it takes some seasoning to have the confidence in yourself that you don't have to do all the work for them. Yeah. And the wisdom to know when to shut up. Or, somebody was asking me this morning on an email if I had any research on teacher talk versus student talk. Like, what's the recommended ratio? Oh, seriously? Like a mathematical? Did anybody say, you should be talking 40% of the time, let the kid... And we've got plenty of formulas about lesson structure. Right. But I haven't seen anything about discourse. There may be stuff out there, but I didn't see it. But I saw lots of stuff about the kinds of talk teachers do. That it's okay for teachers to be talking. But if they're lecturing and just saying, this is what everything means, write it down, it's not helpful. If they're providing guidance and context and probing questions and helping kids reflect and asking them to repeat themselves to hone things down, that's all useful talk. And there can be tons of it, but it's all working on the kids, not just letting them be the audience. And I think that has to be a nice thing for teachers to hear in the long run, because you do, in the theatricality of a classroom, you have to keep the pace going. You can stop and you can pause and you can let them have that think time, and you can count to 10 after you ask a question. And all of the things that allow them that moment. But you can't have dead air. You can have thinking air. And it is a combination of the sage and the coach, because a lot of the teacher talk that's effective is coaching talk. It's reflecting back to them what they did and showing them why it's mistaken and sort of shaping it. Try it again a little bit this way. Lift your arm like that. Put your shoulder into it. The way an athletic coach would be, or lifting a ballet dancer's leg. It's all shaping the performance and making them do it again and giving them feedback, reflecting back, asking questions. But I think there does have to be some of the sagely creating context. This is why this is important. This is why you need to do it. Here's what you're going to get if you can get it. So, I'll do another Cummings story. This is when I was teaching ninth grade, and I read aloud to them the poem "She Being Brand New."
She being brand new and, consequently a little stiff. I was careful of her, and having thoroughly oiled the universal joint, tested my gas, felt of her radiator, made sure her springs were okay. I went right to it, flooded the carburetor, cranked her up, slipped the clutch, and then somehow got into reverse. She kicked. What the hell? Next minute I was back in neutral, tried, and again slowly, barely, nudging my lever right. Oh, and her gears being an A1 shape passed from low through second into high like greased lightning. Just as we turned the corner of Divinity Avenue, I touched the accelerator and give her the juice. Good. It was the first ride, and believe we was happy to see how nice she acted right up to the last minute. Coming back down by the public gardens, I slammed on the internal expanding and external contracting brakes both at once and brought all of her trembling to a dead standstill.
Read aloud to them the poem "She Being Brand New," which violates what I said at the very beginning because it's kind of long. But it's kind of a cool poem. And I was a first-year teacher in that school, so I got away with stuff that I'd probably get fired for. So I read the poem aloud to them. They didn't have it in front of them. And I read it very straightforward. And the poem literally is about taking a new car out for a drive and putting it through its paces. And so I read it to them, and I said, "What's the poem about?" And they said, "It's about a car." I said, "Okay, I'm going to read it again." And then I read it again with a completely different tone of voice, because the poem is actually about sex and about having sex with, a girl who is brand new and taking her out for a ride. Because Cummings likes those kinds of poems. So again, they didn't have it in front of them. I just read it again with a completely different tone, and their jaws dropped. And then I handed it out, and we went through it. And I didn't really know what I was doing, but what I wanted them to have was the experience and the oh my God and the aha moment. And how could it be both things at once? And I think if you tweak that, and that's what I was writing about in that blog post with the other Cummings poem, if it can mean two things at once and not have to resolve into one, because that was the first thing they asked me when they got their hands on it. Is it about a car? Is it about a girl?
Yes.
Yes. That's the whole point of it being a metaphor. It is both.
And it's okay for it to be both. It doesn't have to be.
Yeah. And the fact that it's a girl tells you something about cars, and the fact that it's a car tells you something about his feeling and relationship about girls. And it's important that it's both at the same time, because they reflect on, it's not just one explaining the other. It's they explain each other. They're tied together, and that's what makes it cool.
That makes me think about the other thing that you brought up in the blog post about the Ray Bradbury story and the kids' inability to accept. Was it the same class?
The same class.
Was it the same? And yet, when you brought them the story, the prose story, which isn't poetry, which is, it seems, a very literal story about knights in a dark night. Knights, K-N-I-G-H-T-S. In a dark N-I-G-H-T, that the idea that the dragon could be something other than Smaug, they were incapable of accepting that. And I'll link to the Ray Bradbury.
No, it's a wonderful story, and I think it's the same thing. It's not that it was really a train, but they saw it as a dragon. It has to be both. If you somehow magically could drive a locomotive into the Middle Ages, it would be a dragon. It would be every bit dragonish. It wouldn't just be some strange thing. So it is both. To them, it's a dragon. To the other people, it's a train. And it exists in this both and neither. And that's what's fun about it. And it took a long time to get those kids to the aha moment, and it took too long, and so they didn't have fun with it. Most other kids reading the story have that, oh, that's cool.
Right.
And then if they're just reading it for fun, that's all it ever has to be. If you're going to tear it apart and study it in an English class, then some awful teacher makes you understand why it's cool. But, then you appreciate it, and you see it again later. And I think, the value, if you help the kids understand Catcher in the Rye, the image, and the carousel, then they become independent readers, and they catch those things the next time, and they have the aha moment doesn't just pass them by. They'll catch it next time and just enjoy it.
I think that might be what went wrong for me all the way through high school, was the last aha moment I got with text was in 8th grade. That was the reading teacher who did logical fallacies with us. But he also is the teacher who did all of the O. Henry stories, all of the Guy de Maupassant stories. But I never had, all the way through high school, I never had any teacher bring us to any kind of aha moment. Even my AP class, which I loved, which wasn't to say we didn't enjoy class, but there were no surprises in the texts. And maybe that's why I've had such a hard time with poetry my whole life, is that I just never had anyone say, I didn't even understand that I should read nonfiction and fiction and poetry and theater differently until I dated you. And I said something to you about, how the heck can you? And you said, well, I don't read these, texts on theory the same way that I read Vonnegut. It's a completely different
And I think part of it
approach.
is what you said earlier about how you would do the Holocaust poem with kids and just let them have it and don't do anything with it. I think none of us are given time when we're in school to just linger with something. I think if we read a lot outside of school, we get that because we're just reading it and we can go back and reread it and say, or read it and then go to sleep and just let it rattle around our heads. And I think those are the kids who are going to do better if they just have access to books and poetry as kids, and then whatever gets done to them at school isn't going to kill them. But if all they're getting is it at school and it's all about analysis to death and no appreciation of just being able to read it and reread it, or just say, I'm giving you a Xerox of this poem. I want you to just hang it up over your bed, and I just want you to read it every night, and then in 3 days we're going to talk about it. And just let your brain just sit with it for a while. And the kids would come back with so much more interesting stuff or questions or whatever with just being able to sit with it for a while. We never let anybody sit with anything because the bell rings, we're on to the next thing, and there's a pacing guide, and you have to accomplish and you have to cover.
But you also, if you're teaching, but not only if you're teaching or if you're a parent, your kids have to trust you that when you say, I want you to go home and I want you to hang this over your bed, and every night as you climb into bed, I want you to stop and I want you to look at the text and I want you to read it slowly, not racing through, not pretending. It's not like saying your prayers at night where you pretend that God just knows what you just said and you're so done. Yay, God, let's eat. Amen. You're going to sit there and you're going to read it and you're going to pay attention and then you're going to go to sleep. And on Friday, we're going to talk about it. But we can't have that conversation if you don't do the work. If that's the thing you do the second week of school, you just lost. That's the thing you do in February. That's the thing you do after they trust you, after they know that you're not wasting their time and that you want to know what they have to say.
But I think you also have to trust the stuff you're bringing them to. And it is that scene from Dead Poets Society. If the first thing you do is make them read the introduction about how to graph the quality of a poem, then the entire year is dead. I'm not saying you have to rip the introduction out of the book or make them stand up on a desk and sound their barbaric yawp. But, and this is why poetry is dangerous, I think there's a point at which if you're not going to deal with what a barbaric yawp is and what it means and why it changed American poetry, then don't read it. Because there's no point to it and they're not going to get anything out of it, because poetry takes so much stuff and jams it into such a small space, it's all under pressure. Like if it was real physical stuff that you were jamming into a small thing, and if you touch it, it'll explode, and it's hot. And I think the best poems are like that, and they can be dangerous to unpack because they're about hot emotions and intense feelings, whether it's love or sex or religion or despair. And, what high school teacher feels safe talking about despair
any of those
things? And now, with the new Common Core tests and test samples that I've seen, the poetry that they've included in the sample items is real grown-up poetry.
Really?
Like Anne Sexton, that is not easy for kids to handle, even with guidance. Certainly not by themselves. And it's about tough stuff. I think that's why we teach it badly, is that we don't know it, we don't trust it, and we're scared of really unpacking it and talking with kids about what's in there because we're going to go to dangerous places that are going to get us fired. And so, like I said before, we go to what's been safely anthologized and then pick what's safest there and then talk about half of it.
So what's a teacher supposed to do? Well, that's the question, isn't it?
I don't know. I know what I did, and I got away with it, but I didn't teach for 20 years.
But, well, and we were teaching in New York City, and there's a lot more freedom in New York City than I had in Southern California.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, you've got community standards and school standards, and you've got to live within that stuff. I think you find ways in where you can. I mean, you can teach Fern Hill without getting in trouble. There's nothing evil and ugly in that. There's still amazing, beautiful stuff in there. And I'm wrong, because Fern Hill, you could lead kids into all sorts of stuff because it's about the end of innocence. And the last stanza is childhood disappearing and flying away. And little did I know in these wonderful times that I was going to be dragged in chains off into adulthood. So, in a class in 5 classes a day of 30 kids, are you going to get one kid who's thrown into despair if he understands what that poem's about? Yeah, you probably will.
But if you've done your job, that kid's going to stay just a little bit after class and check in with you. And you're going to be able to see it, and you're going to be able to catch him. And you're going to be able to say, read this other poem tonight.
Yeah. And if you're doing your job right, you do remind them that what's beautiful in this poem is the ability to have lived through that and hold on to it and remember it. And even though you're remembering it with some melancholy, it's one stanza of melancholy and 3 or 4 of absolute joy. And if you can get to adulthood with that combo, then you're doing all right.
Then you win.
The other sick thing we do, because of who we are as a culture, is the only emotion that's safe to talk about in school is sadness. Maybe kind of superficial happiness, but there are no good poems that are just about superficial happiness. Poems about rage, not going to be safe. Poems about lust, and there are some wonderful poems about lust. They're supposed to be intensified emotions, and 90% of them, someone in the school is going to say, you can't talk about that. You can't read that.
Right.
So, despair ends up being the safest thing, and then you can't even do that. Stereotypical adolescent girl mournfulness that you're allowed to have.
Well, you have to take all the dirty jokes out of Romeo and Juliet and Taming of the Shrew and Hamlet. And
yeah. And so why is poetry taught badly? Because the thing that makes it poetry is the thing you're not allowed to talk about, but please go teach it. Even if they know it and know what they're doing, they're going to have their hands tied behind their back.
Yeah. I remember it was my second year teaching, and so I was doing the literary magazine, and the principal called me into his office. I guess I must have had to fly a draft past him or something, because I remember the fact of being in his office and him saying, "So, Heather, do you ever read The New Yorker?" And it was one of those kind of, what? Yeah. You've read the poetry in The New Yorker? I think as the head of the literary magazine, you really need to push the kids to aspire to writing that kind of poetry. And I just kind of, smiled and nodded and walked out of the room and thought, my kid's poetry is awesome. It's hard. It's interesting. It has metaphors. It has similes. It has figurative language. It's complicated. 1994. Writer's block. With poised pen, I stare at the page and pensively await to create. The glaring white sheet stares at me with its blue lines laughingly. Slowly, my pen creaks out a single word. Once. I immediately tear the page out and wad it to practice a 3-point shot into the round file. But once has so many possibilities. Like, once I finish this poem, I am going to slash my true love's throat. Or, once I believed there was justice. Something majestic and real. But now I'm back to empty blue lines. On the other hand, I now have endless possibilities, but still I sit. The little elves that run the gears in my brain didn't eat their Wheaties this morning. My pen feels brave and offers the word escape. This time I miss the 3-point shot. I could have written, escape with me, my love, or escape from me, my love. But again, the blank page leers at me, jeers at me, and still I wait to create. Leslie Marianne Neal, 1994. Feel something, so that got included. And I couldn't explain that to him, but I thought, wow, that's really not getting the whole point of the literary magazine. You know, you take what the kids can do at this level, you refine what they can do at this level, and then you let them show off what they can do at this level. It feels like there's a tension in the educational world between expecting the New Yorker from the students when they write poetry and not understanding that you can't get that from them, not only because they're too young, but because you're not allowed to teach them that kind of poetry at a level that would allow them to understand it and then produce it themselves, because they're not allowed to talk about sex. They're not allowed to talk about...
No, and that's the bind we're all in, is that we're supposed to develop skills, but God help you if they apply it, the skills, analysis to what's in the world around them.
Or logic.
Or expression to anything real in their life.
Right.
You know, so that's why we ended up with reading strategies but no content, and writing 5-paragraph essays about nothing.
Right.
Or we're going to learn poetry because I will now teach you haiku and just write nonsense, but it's got to fit the structure. Or a villanelle, here's an interesting structure, write something. Like, okay, you can learn there's a structure, but how much value is there? Nobody cares what you're expressing, only that you made it rhyme here and there and there.
Right. I remember being graded on stuff like that. I wrote what I thought was a kickin' ballad about moving from California to Tucson. It followed the ballad structure. It actually was based on a song, like a Old West ballad that Dad used to play on the guitar. So I know it's a ballad. And I was criticized because the meter was different than the meter that we had done in class. My rhyme scheme was perfect. My content was ballad, but the meter was a little bit different. It's like, so I get a B-? That was the last time I wrote a ballad.
Right. So that form, which has lasted for hundreds and hundreds of years outside of schooling, to carry information and history and carry it in a way that it can be adapted and added to and added to and added to over the years, is a completely dead form because it got schooled. Right. And it's nothing except this shell, which means nothing but fit into it. Oh, you didn't fit it right. But it's got, and you know, when you divorce that from teaching history or teaching music or teaching anything else, then it doesn't have any meaning there either.
Yeah, that's interesting that you bring up history, because I think I would have understood some things about history much better if my history teachers had brought in poems, especially ballads, because the West, the cremation of Sam McGee, just the exploration of the northern frontier, there's so many places where having access to the poem, which taps into more than just facts, it gets into the emotion, all the stuff that usually gets left out of history, that would have been great.
Well, it's all the separation we do, right? Because why are you teaching music to little kids besides band when they're playing instruments? But when they have that just music class where they sit and sing songs, or they get introduced to the drum, or the teacher brings in different cool instruments. Why is that a completely standalone class, and why isn't it done as part of literature and part of history? So that when you're studying a period of history, you're learning and singing the songs, right? Sing Civil War songs when you're studying the Civil War. You'd get something, especially if you sang some Union songs and some Confederate songs and got both. And, you know, learn music of different cultures when you're studying different cultures. We just artificially carve up the world into all these different pieces that mean nothing separate from everything else.
And teachers are given no time to have that conversation between the disciplines. So if you are an adult and you realize that you completely missed the boat and that poetry has meant nothing to you, but now you're curious and you go, okay, well, maybe there's something worth looking at. Where would you start? Where would you tell somebody to start?
I don't know that I would, because everybody resonates with something different. So I think, you know, go find some anthology and flip through it and just sample stuff till something makes you go, huh. Or ask your partner to read stuff aloud to you, so you can just sit there and listen to it until you go, huh. And then if you like that, read more by that person, or, you know, just experiment. I think, like we said, also, just if you find something that makes you react that way, cut it out and just stick it up on your bulletin board and look at it every once in a while, and don't worry about it. Just let it work on you, and then go find another one. And you'll start figuring out what you know makes your heart vibrate.
Because I didn't have any reaction to that Dylan Thomas piece until I'd gone through it.
No, the Child's
Christmas in Wales, until I'd watched the kids.
Even when we read it aloud that Christmas?
Right over my head. Couldn't have cared less. The imagery in the beginning of that is so dense.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't mean dense like hard to understand. I mean dense as in there is one layer on top of another layer on top of another layer.
No, it's true.
It's packed
And
like
then
a
all
snowball.
of a sudden it ends and you're in
a normal
story.
story. Yeah.
But you're right.
And so how do you get someone to...
But then maybe people don't respond to that. I mean, you claim you don't respond to poetry, but there's some that makes you do that. I read a little piece of that Holocaust poem to you and your eyes bugged out of your head.
I'd never heard anything like that before.
Right. So something in that spoke to you.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter what it was, but, you're not immune to its charms.
I was swayed by its charms. Yes, but if you hadn't read it to me, I would never have come across it before.
I think sometimes it's better to have it read to you.
Maybe I just need to be putting poetry randomly up on the CraftLit podcast feed. And just, without explanation, just it's going to pop up and it's going to be an interlude in between chapters. And it's just a poem to listen to and call it done.
Sure.
Or not.
Or not.
You're no help. He shrugs. It's complicated, though. What do you do as a parent? What do you do as a parent to make sure that you don't kill poetry for your children?
I don't know. What have we done? I don't know whether we've killed it for our children or not, but they definitely enjoy language.
Yeah.
They play with it.
Well, I think there's a lot of freedom to play with language in our home. They don't get in trouble if they make a mistake. And we don't make them feel stupid if they make a mistake.
Well, and they had exposure to lots of fun, interesting literature and fun songs when they were growing up.
It's true.
They're not afraid of it.
No, that's true.
I think you have to assume that coming out of the box, they're primed to enjoy things and experiment with things and take things apart and put them together again. And how does this work? And would it work if I turn it upside down? And we know kids invent slang. When language changes, it's changing from kids. And more and faster now because kids have so much control of the media or influence on it. So they're primed to love playing with language. So I don't think it's that you have to make them do it. I think you have to just get out of their way and not kill them. Give them the exposure, let them connect the dots and have the sparks, and just throw stuff at them for their own enjoyment. And they'll figure out what they like and what they don't like, and try not to schoolicize everything till all the air is out of it.
That's true. I think that is something that we've been better at than I would have anticipated, is that even though we've both been teachers in the past, when we've read a story with them or a book with them, it hasn't been, and so what does Harry Potter's wand represent in this part of the story? There's none of that stuff.
I mean, you ought to be able to come out of Dr. Seuss loving language, because nobody plays with words more than Dr. Seuss does. And our kids both loved all that stuff, and everybody who reads that loves it. I think it's that time after little kids' books when it kind of just dies, which is when they go to school.
Well, and that's like a thing too. With him, we couldn't get him to start a book to save his life. Once he was started, he was fine. But I mean, how many years did I go through having to read him chapter 1 and maybe chapter 1, 2, and 3 of a book before he yanked it out of my hand and said, all right, I'm ready now. And then he was off with the series. I mean, even Percy Jackson, he wouldn't read Percy Jackson. He wouldn't read the Fablehaven books. He wouldn't even read Harry Potter. And sometimes even the second or third, until somebody had read him the first couple chapters. Sometimes maybe it's just having a voice in your head, which again is why listening, Larry Uffelman and I had that debate early on in our professional relationship about whether listening to books whether it was fair to say that if you've listened to a book, you have therefore read the book. And his argument was that it wasn't, because somebody else was providing the voice in your head. And what I used to come back with was, yes, but I've heard not such great readers read books. And me in my head, hearing them do it not well is to correct them in my head, just as I would be doing if I were reading it on the page. I have the voice in my head. They don't match it. My brain fixes that.
But just because you have the voice in your head, your own voice in your head, doesn't mean it's a helpful voice too, because you have all sorts of preconceptions. Like we talked a lot about Dickens because you've been doing so much Dickens. I know when I read Tale of Two Cities, because it was Dickens, the voice in my head through the whole prologue was ponderous and self-important. And the whole,
slow.
it was the best of times, it was the worst of times.
That lofty.
And it was lofty and pretentious.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't, let's get on with the story. But that's not what that prologue is doing, And and again, maybe it's reading it as a kid and you don't know any better, but that's why you need a good teacher. But if the whole book is about dialectics, and it's the two cities and the two guys, and it's a far better thing that I do than I've done, everything in the book is doubles, then that's what that opening chapter is for.
Yeah.
And you can read it with a whole different voice that's much more playful about it's this, but it's also that. It was this, but it's also that. We're going this way, we're going that way. I don't know where we are. And it could set you up for the story much better, but you can set yourself up with no one's help into absolutely hating the book.
Oh, yeah. Well, and I think it's the same thing with Shakespeare, that if your first experience with seeing Shakespeare done is people in stiff ruffs walking uncomfortably about the stage, posturing and gesturing and orating, then you don't get any of the good stuff. You certainly don't get any of the humor, but you also don't get any of the really interesting wordplay, and you don't get any of the really interesting characterization. You don't get the layers of weirdness laid by any of that.
You think it must be polite because it's old, and you miss the
which
fact.
is worse.
Like, no, it was very raw and ugly and blood and guts and people having sex in the audience. It was, believe me, you're much more polite than they were. But you think because it's old and it's in verse that it must be polite. And I think, being willing to talk about the raw stuff helps, I think. And we joked about this before about, letting the high school boys know that, most published poets from hundreds of years ago are men, and they wrote most of their poems to get laid. Like, please don't think for a moment that this is all flowery and, peeling the petals off daisies. I mean, there are some poems like that, but most of them are not.
Yeah, Shelley and Byron, they had a reason for writing the poem.
Yes, some people wander lonely as a cloud, and it's lovely, and others
want to do it in the road. And I mean, yeah, you get in trouble for talking about that stuff, but you can raise your eyebrows and look over the top of your glasses at them and go, eh?
Yeah.
And they supplies the rest of it.
Maybe it's just reading it to them.
Without commentary.
With no commentary, just tone. And, read to the virgins to make much of time. You don't have to say much about it for the class to get what you're talking about.
Right.
Or Sinara, which I love and is one of my favorites and is a really interesting.
Sinara by Ernest Christopher Dowson. Last night, yesternight, betwixt her lips and mine, there fell thy shadow, Sinara, thy breath was shed upon my soul between the kisses and the wine, and I was desolate and sick of an old passion. Yea, I was desolate and bowed my head. I have been faithful to thee, Sinara, in my fashion. All night upon my heart I felt her warm heart beat. Night long within mine arms in love and sleep she lay. Surely the kisses of her bought red mouth were sweet, but I was desolate and sick of an old passion when I awoke and found the dawn was grey. I have been faithful to thee, Sinara, in my fashion. I have forgot much, Sinara, gone with the wind, flung roses riotously with the throng, dancing to put thy pale, lost lilies out of mind. But I was desolate and sick of an old passion, yea, all the time because the dance was long. I have been faithful to thee, Sinara, in my fashion. I cried for madder music and for stronger wine, but when the feast is finished and the lamps expire, then falls thy shadow, Sinara, the night is thine, and I am desolate and sick of an old passion, yea, hungry for the lips of my desire. I have been faithful to thee, Sinara, in my fashion.
Sinara, which I love and is one of my favorites and is a really interesting poem. It's always going to be about not polite, raw stuff. It's about hunger and love and lust and murder and death, and pain. Otherwise it's not worth writing.
Yeah.
They wrote it because it was heightened. So honor that and don't worry about being polite.
Maybe that's why I liked the Romantics. was because they were so far out in front of that. They were so open and forward about what they were doing that they were at least able to break through the veneer. You could tell. You could just tell because they're so obvious about it.
Yep, and I had trouble with that in school because it looked polite to me because it was very metered and it rhymed nicely, and it didn't feel immediate to me. It felt nice clothes, very polite, and that's the way it was introduced to me, and it always had that veneer to me.
Oh, that's interesting.
Where Shakespeare and John Donne and people like that didn't, and the moderns didn't.
That's interesting because my reaction to the moderns was so pained and restricted. I think I must have gotten the Romantics in college, in my teaching credential time, because I know we were talking about Byron and all of his many layers.
It wasn't high school.
That must have been part of it, because we did the moderns in high school, and it was. I didn't like Eliot. I didn't like proof rock.
You didn't like proof rock?
There was nothing about proof rock that spoke to me until I was teaching, and then I went, "Oh,
that's interesting."
Goodness gracious! And then I liked it a lot.
I felt very proof rock like even at 17.
This doesn't surprise me somehow.
And I figured, if Eliot could write it at 27 about someone who's supposed to be whatever he is, 47, then at 17 I can have access to it too.
I dare to eat a peach, though.
Well, good.
And John Scholes, our Jonathan Harker from Dracula, was kind enough to read Sonara for me, and actually read a couple of other poems that I wasn't able to fit in today. But his comment was, "You don't like poems that rhyme or have regular meter? Or what?" So, to make himself and me happy, he recorded The Walrus and the Carpenter for us. And that is what I will play you out on. Have a great week. I'll talk to you next week, and we'll have more Elizabeth Gaskell. Take care. Bye.
The Walrus and the Carpenter by Lewis Carroll. The sun was shining on the sea, shining with all his might. He did his very best to make the billows smooth and bright, and this was odd, because it was the middle of the night. The moon was shining sulkily because she thought the sun had got no business to be there after the day was done. "It's very rude of him," she said, "to come and spoil the fun." The sea was wet as wet could be, the sands were dry as dry. You could not see a cloud because no cloud was in the sky. No birds were flying overhead, there were no birds to fly. The Walrus and the Carpenter were walking close at hand. They wept like anything to see such quantities of sand. "If this were only cleared away," they said, "it would be grand. If 7 maids with 7 mops swept it for half a year, do you suppose," the Walrus said, "that they could get it clear?" "I doubt it," said the Carpenter, and shed a bitter tear. "Oh, oysters, come and walk with us," the Walrus did beseech. "A pleasant walk, a pleasant talk, along the briny beach. We cannot do it with more than 4 to give a hand to each." The eldest oyster looked at him, but never a word he said. The eldest oyster winked his eye and shook his heavy head, meaning to say he did not choose to leave the oyster bed. But 4 young oysters hurried up, all eager for the treat. Their coats were brushed, their faces washed, their shoes were clean and neat. And this was odd because, they hadn't any feet. 4 other oysters followed them, and yet another 4, and thick and fast they came at last, and more and more and more, all hopping through the frothy waves and scrambling to the shore. The Walrus and the Carpenter walked on a mile or so, and then they rested on a rock conveniently low, and all the little oysters stood and waited in a row. "The time has come," the Walrus said, "to talk of many things, of shoes and ships and sealing wax, of cabbages and kings, and why the sea is boiling hot, and whether pigs have wings." "But wait a bit," the oysters cried, "before we have our chat, for some of us are out of breath and all of us are fat." "Now, Harry," said the Carpenter, they thanked him much for that. "A loaf of bread," the Walrus said, "is what we chiefly need. Pepper and vinegar besides are very good indeed. Now if you're ready, oysters dear, we can begin to feed." "But not on us," the oysters cried, turning a little blue. "After such kindness that would be a dismal thing to do." "The night is fine," the Walrus said. "Do you admire the view? It was so nice of you to come, and you are very nice." The Carpenter said nothing but, "Cut us another slice. I wish you were not quite so deaf, I've had to ask you twice." It seems a shame, the walrus said, to play them such a trick, after we've brought them out so far and made them trot so quick. The carpenter said nothing, but the butter's spread too thick. I weep for you, the walrus said, I deeply sympathize. With sobs and tears he sorted out those of the largest size, holding his pocket handkerchief before his streaming eyes. Oh, oysters, said the carpenter, you've had a pleasant run. Should we be trotting home again? But answer came there none, and this was scarcely odd because they'd eaten every one. The end.
356, Chapter 37. Book talk begins at... Welcome to CraftLit, the podcast for crafters who love books. I'm your host, Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania. Episode 356, Escape. Well, hello. I hope you had a good week. I did, I think. It's all been a blur since we released the poetry podcast. I'm so glad you liked it. We got such lovely emails back from people. Andrew and I were both completely and utterly freaked out as soon as I released the podcast because I've never done anything like that for the podcast, and he doesn't podcast, so for him it was a completely strange thing. But I am very, very glad that we were able to introduce you to some poetry you may not have heard of before and play for you some poetry that you've known and loved. And more than one person said that listening to the conversation made them reevaluate their own reactions to poetry, which I thought was about the best response I could think of. So thank you. Thank you for your forbearance. Thank you for your willingness to go someplace where we hadn't gone to before. And thank you for coming back. We do have a regular episode today, and I hope it can be an escape for you, because I woke up this morning to more crazy news from the world. It looks like things are just falling apart, and that's never fun. And I need an escape, so I assume you might as well. And I also wanted to thank you for listening, just in general. I found out that on Libsyn, the company that hosts the podcast feed, builds the apps, makes it possible to have the premium channel. On their site, the mean number of downloads per episode is 154. The average number of downloads for one episode after 1 month of release is 2,067. And I am happy to say that CraftLit has far surpassed both of those for the last 8 years by a lot of downloads. I just don't check stats very often because I know they fluctuate with the book. And so it's kind of useless. I mean, I can kind of compare books and see which ones were more popular than the others. But when I went to check the stats, I found out that we have had more than 2.5 million downloads. So when I say we are our own zeitgeist, it's kind of true. We're pushing the world in our direction, which is such a good thing to think about. So thank you. Thank you for leaving reviews for CraftLit on iTunes, on Stitcher, for liking us on Facebook. You have made it possible for some very, very exciting things to happen. And if all goes well, I will be able to tell you what the most recent, really unbelievable and exciting thing is next week. But I can't tell you yet. Regardless, thank you so much. And thank you for calling and leaving comments like this.
Hey, Heather, it's Lise, Knitting Rose. I was calling because you are encouraging me to listen and read books in a different way. What I mean is by explaining to us some of the idioms and some of the slang terminology in the different books, you're making me and helping me to listen to books, and when I hear phrases that I may know what they mean from the context, but they're not familiar, I look them up or I think about them. For example, one of the things I heard was that the policemen were as broken reeds. And I knew from the context that it meant that they were ineffective, but it made me think, was it talking about musical reeds? Was it talking about reeds in the swamps? What was it talking about? So I dug a little bit deeper in my mind and in research. I just wanted to let you know that it's so valuable to have someone like you who is reviewing and helping us look over books in a new way and in a different context. And you're enriching my life. So thank you so much for what you do.
I received a remarkable number of emails, Ravelry messages, and comments on the show notes about the up to London, down to Milton phenomenon. And 99.9 of them said, no, it really is a class thing. London is perceived as being the epicenter, and therefore everybody goes up to London. And this includes emails from a bunch of people who are actually up in Manchester, down in Manchester, who said, no, it's the way they grew up. They hadn't even thought about it until I asked the question and then went, oh my gosh, what? And then we got one comment on the show notes from Allison, who wrote in, Heather, regarding the up to London, down to Milton question, I think this goes back to the railways yet again. The London direction was known as the up line and the opposite as the down line, hence up to London, down to wherever the train had come from. The up to London part is still very common usage. The down part is more driven by north-south direction. I live halfway between London and Cambridge, so due north of London, due south of Cambridge, roughly. I would say I'm going up to both of them. However, I regularly go down to Bristol, which is due west of London. Interestingly, on a recent trip to Glasgow, I found out that they go through to Edinburgh, roughly due east. There's also the usage of going up to Oxford or Cambridge University and being sent down if you've been expelled. In my experience, that's limited to those two universities. And I thought that was very interesting. The trains. We talked a lot about the trains when we did Dracula. And it's true that this would have been the era when train influence would have been pretty big. So there it is. And our chapter today is chapter 37, or volume 2, chapter 12. And the chapter is called Looking South. And along with all the other things that the South has come to represent in this book, one of the things is the lack of machinery. I got a very interesting phone message this week from a listener about how the machinery that they used during this time was constructed and why you needed children. Now, the audio on this is hard to hear, so if the interference from the phone line is too much for you, you can skip ahead to 23 minutes, 17 seconds, where I'll sum up. Or you can just go to CraftLit.com, episode 356, and look at the videos that I posted there. But if you're listening on a headset when you do that, please turn the volume down.
Hey, Heather, this is Dixie, otherwise known as BESV72 on Ravelry. I was listening to you talk about some of the machinery in action that was used during the Hale time period. And if I remember correctly, everything during that time period was run off of a single shaft running along the top of the ceiling of the roof, and everything was done with some sort of a pulley system. You're talking about skilled labor, and that was extremely skilled. And again, if I'm remembering history correctly, there are a lot of deaths and a lot of child labor enforced during those times because the kids could get in and use or reach around the equipment while it's down. But speaking of a skilled machine operator, when I was in college, I worked full-time in a factory running a fairly sophisticated piece of machinery at the time, and if you work it long enough, you learn how it sounds, and you can always tell when it's running differently. And in today's world, and all the pictures that I saw at the time, it was absolutely terrifying to know that we didn't have OSHA or Occupational Safety and Health Association or whatever the acronym is. But it's kind of crazy to know how many people survived those factories back in the days. And then the guideline book here in the U.S. is literally nothing more than a history book of accidents that have happened in the past that could have been prevented. If you're really interested in seeing some of the machine shop used and built in that time period, downtown Philly is kind of a sketchy neighborhood in a saw factory that still uses a lot of the old methods. Most of the machines have been updated, but they still have a few, and they have a precision saw blade balancer that uses the old method, the most up-to-date piece of equipment. Literally, they put these giant 48-inch diameter saw blades up, spin it around at whatever the operating speed is, and he whacks it with a hammer to put it in balance. If you were interested in ever touring that facility, let me know, and I'll get the names to you. I believe they still periodically have historical site tours and whatnot because it is part of the Historical Society.
So Dixie, absolutely send me the information on that place in Philadelphia. I think, if I heard correctly, it's the Tacony neighborhood, Tacony, and it was the Diston Saw Works. And if that's right, then the Saw Works were the main #1 manufacturer of saws and saw blades in the United States for almost 100 years. The percentage of how many saw blades there were out there by this company was ridiculous. I know that voicemail was hard to hear. That was after I cleaned up the audio as well. Technology, sometimes it works. Sometimes the phone, she not so perfect. One of the things that she was talking about was the central bar above the weaving machines. If you are able to go to the website, you will actually see this in action, because when we did the CraftLit London, Bath and Wales trip in 2010 with the fabulous Diane from Holiday Vacations, we went to the Wool Museum where we were able to see these machines in action. If you do go watch the videos, you might want to lower the volume. It's loud. But for me, it did two things. Number one, it makes a lot of sense why everybody who worked there wanted more money, because, oh my gosh, if you can imagine an entire building full of these machines, wow. But the other thing is Mrs. Thornton has every right to be really impressed with their technology. So that's a little side note on the history of that kind of technology. And don't forget, if you have a comment, you can now call 206-350-1642. The number is listed at the top of the show notes if you are on your smartphone app. And if you listen on a tablet, which doesn't have phone capability, or on a computer or a laptop that has a microphone, you'll now see a little tab on the right-hand side of the show notes screen. It says Leave Feedback. That'll have you download a little app if you're on a tablet, and it'll use the tablet's microphone to record a message and send it to me as an MP3 file, which I can then play. So now there are two different ways to send in feedback. So we've lost Boucher. We've met his brood. It's a sad time. And we know Higgins was very upset by the whole thing. So Looking South is an interesting title for this chapter. There are some slang terms. Redding up would be cleaning up. Fettling, Fettling, is to put something in order. Nesh is being particular about something. So if you won't nesh yourself, you won't get all particular and persnickety about something. And those are all the terms that you're going to need access to. But you are going to hear a Margaret with a very different attitude. Now that she's been through all that she's been through in Milton, she has grown up in ways that I had not anticipated. I certainly hadn't anticipated at this point in the book. But you can tell from how she responds to people in this chapter that she has learned a great deal about other people, and that her preconceived notions and biases and prejudices are really just kind of being shed. She's shedding these old thoughts and ways of thinking and prejudices and biases. She's just shedding them as she goes. And some of those are about Thornton, but a lot of them are just about people. And it's kind of nice to see. And then almost at the very end, she says something kind of snarky about the Irish, which bugged me. But I guess she hasn't lost all of her prejudices and biases. So today's chapter, interesting chapter for Margaret, but a rather small chapter for plot, which is fine. So here we go with chapter 37 of Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South.
Chapter 37. Looking South. A spade, a rake, a hoe, a pickaxe, or a bill, a hook to reap or a scythe to mow, a flail, or what you will. And here's a ready hand to ply the needful tool, and skilled enough by lessons rough in labor's rugged school. Hood. Higgins' door was locked the next day when they went to pay their call on the widow Boucher, but they learnt this time from an officious neighbour that he was really from home. He had, however, been in to see Mrs. Boucher before starting on his day's business, whatever that was. It was but an unsatisfactory visit to Mrs. Boucher. She considered herself as an ill-used woman by her poor husband's suicide, and there was quite germ of truth enough in this idea to make it a very difficult one to refute. Still, it was unsatisfactory to see how completely her thoughts were turned upon herself and her own position, and this selfishness extended even to her relations with her children, whom she considered as encumbrances, even in the very midst of her somewhat animal affection for them. Margaret tried to make acquaintances with one or two of them, while her father strove to raise the widow's thoughts into some higher channel than that of mere helpless querulousness. She found that the children were truer and simpler mourners than the widow. Daddy had been a kind daddy to them. Each could tell, in their eager, stammering way, of some tenderness shown, some indulgence granted by the lost father.
"Is yon thing upstairs really him? It doesna look like him. I'm feared on it, and I never was feared o' Daddy."
Margaret's heart bled to hear that the mother, in her selfish requirement of sympathy, had taken her children upstairs to see their disfigured father. It was intermingling the coarseness of horror with the profoundness of natural grief. She tried to turn their thoughts in some other direction, on what they could do for mother, on what, for this was a more efficacious way of putting it, what father would have wished them to do. Margaret was more successful than Mr. Hale in her efforts. The children, seeing their little duties lie in action close around them, began to try, each one, to do something that she suggested towards redding up the slatternly room. But her father set too high a standard and too abstract a view before the indolent invalid. She could not rouse her torpid mind into any vivid imagination of what her husband's misery might have been before he had resorted to the last terrible step. She could only look upon it as it affected herself. She could not enter into the enduring mercy of the God who had not specially interposed to prevent the water from drowning her prostrate husband. And although she was secretly blaming her husband for having fallen into such drear despair, and denying that he had any excuse for his last rash act, she was inveterate in her abuse of all who could, by any possibility, be supposed to have driven him to such desperation. The masters, Mr. Thornton in particular, whose mill had been attacked by Boucher, and who, after the warrant had been issued for his apprehension on the charge of rioting, had caused it to be withdrawn. The union, of which Higgins was the representative to the poor woman. The children, so numerous, so hungry, and so noisy, all made up one great army of personal enemies whose fault it was that she was now a helpless widow. Margaret heard enough of this unreasonableness to dishearten her, and when they came away she found it impossible to cheer her father.
"It is the town life," said she. "Their nerves are quickened by the haste and bustle and speed of everything around them, to say nothing of the confinement in these pent-up houses, which of itself is enough to induce depression and worry of spirits. Now, in the country, people live so much more out of doors, even children, and even in the winter."
But people must live in towns, and in the country some get such stagnant habits of mind that they are almost fatalists.
"Yes, I acknowledge that. I suppose each mode of life produces its own trials and its own temptations. The dweller in towns must find it as difficult to be patient and calm as the country-bred man must find it to be active and equal to unwanted emergencies. Both must find it hard to realize a future of any kind, the one because the present is so living and hurrying and close around him, The other because his life tempts him to revel in the mere sense of animal existence, not knowing of, and consequently not caring for, any pungency of pleasure for the attainment of which he can plan and deny himself and look forward. And thus both the necessity for engrossment and the stupid content in the present produce the same effects. But this poor Mrs. Boucher, how little we can do for her. And yet we dare not leave her without our efforts, although they may seem so useless. Oh, Papa, it's a hard world to live in. So it is, my child. We feel it so just now at any rate. But we have been very happy, even in the midst of our sorrow. What a pleasure Frederick's visit was. Yes, that it was, said Margaret brightly. It was such a charming, snatched, forbidden thing. But she suddenly stopped speaking. She had spoiled the remembrance of Frederick's visit to herself by her own cowardice. Of all faults, the one she most despised in others was the want of bravery, the meanness of heart which leads to untruth. And here had she been guilty of it. Then came the thought of Mr. Thornton's cognizance of her falsehood. She wondered if she should have minded detection half so much from anyone else. She tried herself in imagination with her Aunt Shaw and Edith, with her father, with Captain and Mr. Lennox, with Frederick. The thought of the last knowing what she had done, even in his own behalf, was the most painful, for the brother and sister were in the first flush of their mutual regard and love. But even any fall in Frederick's opinion was as nothing to the shame, the shrinking shame she felt at the thought of meeting Mr. Thornton again. And yet she longed to see him, to get it over, to understand where she stood in his opinion. Her cheeks burnt as she recollected how proudly she had implied an objection to trade in the early days of their acquaintance, because it too often led to the deceit of passing off inferior for superior goods in the one branch, of assuming credit for wealth and resources not possessed in the other. She remembered Mr. Thornton's look of calm disdain as, in few words, he gave her to understand that, in the great scheme of commerce, all dishonorable ways of acting were sure to prove injurious in the long run, and that, testing such action simply according to the poor standard of success, there was folly and not wisdom in all such and every kind of deceit in trade, as well as in other things. She remembered, she, then strong in her own untempted truth, asking him if he did not think that buying in the cheapest and selling in the dearest market proved some want of the transparent justice which is so intimately connected with the idea of truth. And she had used the word chivalric, and her father had corrected her with the higher word, Christian, and so drawn the argument upon himself, while she sat silent by with a slight feeling of contempt. No more contempt for her, no more talk about the chivalric. Henceforward, she must feel humiliated and disgraced in his sight. But when should she see him? Her heart leapt up in apprehension at every ring of the doorbell, and yet, when it fell down to calmness, she felt strangely saddened and sick at heart at each disappointment. It was very evident that her father expected to see him, and was surprised that he did not come. The truth was that there were points in their conversation the other night on which they had no time then to enlarge, but it had been understood that if possible, on the succeeding evening, if not then, at least the very first evening that Mr. Thornton could command, they should meet for further discussion. Mr. Hale had looked forward to this meeting ever since they had parted. He had not yet resumed the instruction to his pupils, which he had relinquished at the commencement of his wife's more serious illness, so he had fewer occupations than usual, and the great interest of the last day or so, Boucher's suicide, had driven him back with more eagerness than ever upon his speculations.
He was restless all evening. He kept saying, "I quite expected to have seen Mr. Thornton. I think the messenger who brought the book last night must have had some note and forgot to deliver it. Do you think there has been any message left today?" "I will go and inquire, Papa," said Margaret, after the changes on these sentences had been rung once or twice. "Stay, there's a ring." She sat down instantly and bent her head attentively over her work. She heard a step on the stairs, but it was only one, and she knew it was Dixon's. She lifted up her head and sighed, and believed she felt glad.
"It's that Higgins, sir. He wants to see you, or else Miss Hale, or it might be Miss Hale first, and then you, sir, for he's in a strange kind of way."
"He had better come up here, Dixon, and then he can see us both, and choose which he likes for his listener."
"Oh, very well, sir. I've no wish to hear what he's got to say, I'm sure. Only, if you could see his shoes, I'm sure you'd say the kitchen was the fitter place."
"He can wipe them, I suppose," said Mr. Hale. So Dixon flung off to bid him walk upstairs. She was a little mollified, however, when he looked at his feet with a hesitating air, and then, sitting down on the bottom stair, he took off the offending shoes and without a word walked upstairs. "Servant, sir," said he, slicking his hair down when he came into the room. "If her'll excuse me," looking at Margaret, "for being in my stockings, I's been tramping a day, and streets is none of the cleanest." Margaret thought that fatigue might account for the change in his manner, for he was unusually quiet and subdued, and he had evidently some difficulty in saying what he came to say. Mr. Hale's ever-ready sympathy with anything of shyness or hesitation or want of self-possession made him come to his aid.
"We shall have tea up directly, and then you'll take a cup with us, Mr. Higgins. I am sure you are tired if you've been out much this wet, relaxing day. Margaret, my dear, can't you hasten tea?"
Margaret could only hasten tea by taking the preparation of it into her own hands, and so offending Dixon, who was emerging out of her sorrow for her late mistress into a very touchy, irritable state. But Martha, like all who came in contact with Margaret, even Dixon herself in the long run, felt it a pleasure and an honor to forward any of her wishes, and her readiness and Margaret's sweet forbearance soon made Dixon ashamed of herself.
"Why, master, and you must always be asking the lower classes upstairs since we came to Milton. I cannot understand. Folk at Elston were never brought higher than the kitchen, and I've let one or two of them know before now that they might think it an honor to be even there."
Higgins found it easier to unburden himself to one than to two. After Margaret left the room, he went to the door and assured himself that it was shut. Then he came and stood close to Mr. Hale. "Master," said he, "you'd not guess easy what I've been tramping after today, especially if you remember my manner of talk yesterday. I've been seeking a work." "I have," said he. "I said to myself I'd keep a civil tongue in my head, let who would say what 'em would. I'd set my teeth into my tongue sooner nor speak in haste. For that man's sake, you understand," jerking his thumb back in some unknown direction. "No, I don't," said Mr. Hale, seeing he waited for some kind of assent, and completely bewildered as to who that man could be. "That chap as lies there," said he with another jerk. "Him as went and drowned it himself, poor chap. I did not think he'd got it in him to lie still and let the water creep o'er him till he died. Boucher, you know." "Yes, I know now," said Mr. Hale. "Go back to what you were saying. You'd not speak in haste?" "For his sake. Yet not for his sake, for wherever he is, and whatever, he'll ne'er know other clemming or code again, but for the wife's sake and the bits o' childer."
"God bless you,"
said Mr. Hale, starting up. Then, calming down, he said breathlessly,
What do you mean? Tell me out.
I have told you, said Higgins, a little surprised at Mr. Hale's agitation. I wouldna ask for work for myself, but them's left as a charge on me. I reckon I would have guided Boucher to a better end, but I set him off the road, and so I mun answer for him. Mr. Hale got hold of Higgins' hand and shook it heartily without speaking. Higgins looked awkward and ashamed.
There, master. There's ne'er a man to call a man amongst us, but what would do the same, aye, and better too, for believe me, I's ne'er got a stroke o' work, nor yet a sight of any. For all I'd tell Damper that, let alone his pledge, which I would not sign. No, I couldna, not even for this. He'd ne'er ha' such a worker on his mill as I would be. He'd ha' none o' me, no more would none o' the others. I'm a poor black feckless sheep, child of me clem for aught I can do, unless, Parson, you'd help me.
Help you? How? I would do anything, but what can I do?
Miss there, for Margaret had re-entered the room and stood silent, listening, as often talk grand o' the south and the ways down there. Now, I do not know how far off it is, but I've been thinking if I could get 'em down there, where food is cheap and wages good, and all the folk, rich and poor, master and man, friendly like, you could maybe help me to work. I'm not 45, and I have a deal of strength in me, master.
But what kind of work could you do, my man?
Well, I reckon I could spade a bit.
And for that, said Margaret, stepping forwards, for anything you could do, Higgins, with the best will in the world, you would maybe get 9 shillings a week, maybe 10 at the outside. Food is much the same as here, except that you might have a little garden.
The chowder could work at that, said he. I'm sick o' Milton anyways, and Milton is sick o' me.
You must not go to the south, said Margaret, for all that. You could not stand it. You would have to be out all weathers. It would kill you with rheumatism. The mere bodily work at your time of life would break you down. The fare is far different to what you've been accustomed to.
I's not particular about my meat, said he, as if offended.
But you've reckoned on having butcher's meat once a day if you're in work. Pay for that out of your 10 shillings and keep those poor children if you can. I owe it to you, since it's my way of talking that has set you off on this idea, to put it all clear before you. You would not bear the dullness of the life. You don't know what it is. It would eat you away like rust. Those that have lived there all their lives are used to soaking in the stagnant waters. They labor on from day to day in the great solitude of steaming fields, never speaking or lifting up their poor bent downcast heads. The hard spade work robs their brain of life. The sameness of their toil deadens their imagination. They don't care to meet to talk over thoughts and speculations, even of the weakest, wildest kind, after their work is done. They go home brutishly tired, poor creatures, caring for nothing but food and rest. You could not stir them up into any companionship which you get in a town as plentiful as the air you breathe, whether it be good or bad, and that I don't know, but I do know that you of all men are not one to bear a life among such laborers. What would be peace to them would be eternal fretting to you. Think no more of it, Nicholas, I beg. Besides, you could never pay to get mother and children all there. That's one good thing.
I've reckoned for that. One house mun do for us all, and the furniture to the other would go a good way. And men there mun have their families to keep, mayhap and 6 or 7 childer, God help 'em, said he, more convinced by his own presentation of the facts than by all Margaret had said, and
suddenly renouncing the idea which had but recently formed itself in a brain worn out by the day's fatigue and anxiety.
God help 'em. North and South have each getten their own troubles. If work's sure and steady there, labour's paid at starvation prices, while here when rooks o' money coming in one quarter and near a farther the next. For sure, the world is in a confusion that passes me or any other man to understand. It needs fettling, and who's to fettle it if it's as yon folks say, and there's naught but what we see.
Mr. Hale was busy cutting bread and butter. Margaret was glad of this, for she saw that Higgins was better left to himself, that if her father began to speak ever so mildly on the subject of Higgins' thoughts, the latter would consider himself challenged to an argument and would feel himself bound to maintain his own ground. She and her father kept up an indifferent conversation until Higgins, scarcely aware whether he ate or not, had made a very substantial meal. Then he pushed his chair away from the table and tried to take an interest in what they were saying, but it was of no use, and he fell back into dreamy gloom. Suddenly, Margaret said she had been thinking of it for some time, but the words had stuck in her throat.
"Higgins, have you been to Marlborough Mills to seek for work?"
"Thornton's?" asked he. I've been at Thornton's."
"And what did he say?"
"Such a chap as me is not like to see the master. The o'erlooker bid me go and be damned."
"I wish you had seen Mr. Thornton," said Mr. Hale. "He might not have given you work, but he would not have used such language."
"As to the language, I'm well used to it. It do not matter to me. I'm not nish myself when I'm put out. It were the fact that I were no wanted there, no more nor any other place as I minded."
"But I wish you had seen Mr. Thornton," repeated Margaret. "Would you go again? It's a good deal to ask, I know, but would you go tomorrow and try him? I should be so glad if you would."
"I'm afraid it would be of no use," said Mr. Hale in a low voice. "It would be better to let me speak to him."
Margaret still looked at Higgins for his answer. Those grave, soft eyes of hers were difficult to resist. He gave a great sigh.
"It would tax my pride above a bit. If it were for myself, I could stand a deal of clemming first. I'd sooner knock him down than ask a favour from him. I'd a deal sooner be flogged myself. But you're not a common wench, axing your pardon, nor yet have you common ways about you. I'll even make a wry face and go at it tomorrow. Dunna you think that he'll do it? That man has it in him to be burnt at the stake afore he'll give in. I'd do it for your sake, Miss Hale, and it's first time in my life as e'er I give way to a woman. Neither my wife nor Bess could e'er say that much agin me."
"All the more do I thank you," said Margaret, smiling. "Though I don't believe you. I believe you have just given way to wife and daughter as much as most men." "And as to Mr. Thornton," said Mr. Hale, "I'll give you a note to him which I think I may venture to say will ensure you a hearing."
"Thank you kindly, sir, but I'd as lief stand on my own bottom. I do not stomach the notion of having favour curried for me by one as doesn't know the ins and outs of the quarrel. Meddling twixt master and man is like a meddling twixt husband and wife than aught else. It takes a deal of wisdom for to do any good. I'll stand guard at the lodge door. I'll stand there from 6 in the morning till I get speech on him, but I'd liefer sweep the streets if paupers had not go hold on that work. Dunna you hope, miss. There'll be more chance of getting milk out of a flint. I wish you a very good night, and many thanks to you."
"You'll find your shoes by the kitchen fire. I took them there to dry," said Margaret. He turned round and looked at her steadily, and then he brushed his lean hand across his eyes and went his way.
"How proud that man is,"
said her father, who was a little annoyed at the manner in which Higgins had declined his intercession with Mr. Thornton. "He is," said Margaret, "but what grand makings of a man there are in him, pride and all." "It's amusing to see how he evidently respects the part in Mr. Thornton's character which is like his own." "There's granite in all these northern people, Papa, is there not?" "There was none in poor Boucher, I'm afraid. None in his wife, either." "I should guess from their tones that they had Irish blood in them. I wonder what success he'll have tomorrow, if he and Mr. Thornton would speak out together as man to man, if Higgins would forget that Mr. Thornton was a master and speak to him as he does to us, and if Mr. Thornton would be patient enough to listen to him with his human heart, not with his master's ears." "You are getting to do Mr. Thornton justice at last, Margaret," said her father, pinching her ear. Margaret had a strange choking at her heart which made her unable to answer. "Oh," thought she, "I wish I were a man, that I could go and force him to express his disapprobation, and tell him honestly that I knew I deserved it. It seems hard to lose him as a friend, just when I had begun to feel his value. How tender he was with dear Mamma. If it were only for her sake, I wish he would come, and then at least I should know how much I was abased in his eyes."
So Margaret finally had to come to terms with the fact that the South is not the solution to everything. And she got there so quietly and without us noticing. Our little girl grew up. I don't know about you, but it was a sizable surprise for me to hear that kind of honesty from her. Or I guess I mean that level of honesty. And it was good to finally hear about the South for real, to hear the honesty of what was actually going on living in the South, how agrarian and how hard life could be. It wasn't noisy and it wasn't dusty and it wasn't smoky, but it was hard. And farmers didn't get meat every day, and the people in Milton do. I thought that was probably as telling as any other piece of information that we've gotten about what life was like, and how very, very lucky we are to be living when we are, where we are. I also thought it was interesting at the beginning of this chapter that perhaps for the first time that I'm able to recall, we really heard some bias from Elizabeth Gaskell about Mrs. Boucher. It seemed to me that there are ways that widows who have children should behave, and Mrs. Boucher is not behaving that way. And it was also interesting because Gaskell seems to put Mrs. Boucher into the category of, oh, I guess she's Irish, and that explains everything. And I thought, well, that's an interesting bias too. Not that I'm surprised by it, but that Gaskell has been so careful about being biasless that to hear that was a surprise. At least it surprised me. It may not have surprised you at all. But at least we got to end today with a mention of Mr. Thornton, who, I don't know about you, but I've been missing him. I'm looking forward to another Thornton chapter soon. And that's it. Take care. Have a great week. I'll talk to you soon. Have a great one. Bye. 357, Chapter 38. Book Talk begins. Welcome to CraftLit, the podcast for crafters who love books. I'm your host, Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania. Episode 357, The Bluest Eyes. Well, Chapter 38, which is Volume 2, Chapter 13. I believe last week I made some comment despairing that we hadn't had a Mr. Thornton chapter for a while. And today, we make up for it. Mr. Thornton makes an appearance, and it's one of his most frustrating for me, but I'll explain why it's frustrating after you listen. But he is such an interesting man. You'll see him in a couple of different scenes with a couple of different people during today's chapter, and the amount of restraint he shows at home and in business, I just find fascinating. He's such an interesting character when we really get down to taking time to get to know him. There are a couple of interesting terms that pop up in here, and one of them is a word that I'm pretty sure you've all heard before. I know I had come across it in books before. It is piqued, not P-E-A-K-E-D, but P-I-Q-U-E-D. The way I've heard it most often, is something piqued my interest or piqued her interest, that it was something that popped up and made you go, oh, what's that about? Well, in this case, it means something that you've prided yourself on. So if you've piqued yourself on your ability to be kind, it's some part of your character that you are kind of proud of. So listen for that. You will hear Mr. Thornton say something to his mother that I found hysterical. He compliments her at one point, and just listen to the compliment and then listen to how you've seen her portrayed so far. It's one of those interesting moments where you're thinking, okay, did Gaskell throw that in to be funny? Or is that supposed to show us what Thornton really thinks of his mother? I suppose it's the latter. But to me, it was very funny. The chapter is third person, as it usually is. But this chapter does some kind of Dickensian things, like in Bleak House, how you have the Esther narrator and the third person narrator. Usually our narrator isn't so omniscient, unless we're in Margaret's mind. This chapter, we will spend some time in and around Thornton's mind, but we'll also get to go inside the mind of Mrs. Thornton. And the description of how she's feeling and how she's seeing things is very interesting. But she uses a term which I had never come across before. Used metaphorically, there is a line saying, her sharp Damascus blade seemed out of place and useless among rose leaves. Well, this is a curious line. Damascus steel was originally developed in India a bazillion years ago. It was an extraordinary smelting method. They added strange stuff to it, and it created an impressively flexible but hard steel, which was famous for its use in weaponry. So it started production in India, but it moved across the region eventually. And there's some discussion about whether it's called a Damascus blade, meaning a really, really good weapon, sharp and powerful and of great quality. There's some debate about whether it's because these particular weapons were manufactured in Damascus, in Syria, or if they're called Damascus blades because the exterior of this kind of steel, or at least the blades, has a really interesting kind of watermark pattern on it that looks a lot like damask cloth, which comes from Damascus. It always comes back to fabric, doesn't it? Regardless the origin of the term, the meaning of this statement is quite lovely and telling, insightful. Her sharp Damascus blade seemed out of place and useless among rose leaves. Now, there were stories of Damascus blades being able to, slice through a hair when it was falling through the air and all sorts of stuff like this. But really what this comes down to is when you're sitting in the middle of a rose garden, it seems a little silly to pull your sword out to have a look. Apples and oranges. That's all. But I thought the Damascus blade thing, that's interesting because it's not Sword of Damocles. I thought at first, it's typo. And then I went, I think that's a thing. And where did Heather learn about the Sword of Damocles? From the Rocky Horror Picture Show. Yeah, I don't know if I'm proud of that or not. I'll let you know. There will be more slights against the Irish. I apologize for that. I'm assuming that this is because when there were strikes in Manchester, Irish were brought over as knobsticks, as scabs, as strike breakers, the people who crossed the line. And those poor Irish workers must have been roundly criticized by the surrounding community. So, of course, Gaskell would have picked up on that. Demagogue, if you're not familiar with that, they're kind of like rabble-rousers, people who are trying to stir up the pot. This goes back to Greek In ancient Greece and in Rome too, demagogue was a leader or an orator who espoused the cause of the common people. It comes from Greek originally, a Greek word meaning to lead, a verb, and the Greek demos, which is the people. So you get dema from that, and agian, which is to lead, becoming agogos, which means leading. So you got demos and agogos, and you get demagogue, somebody who is trying to lead the people. That's what demagogue means, and it'll pop up today. You'll hear more northern dialect slang, some of which I have not been able to identify the term for. So if you hear slang that you know, nobody else is going to know what it means, let us know. Either call in 206-350-1642 or leave a comment in the show notes. And that is it, my dears. We will now listen to Chapter 38, Promises Fulfilled.
Chapter 38, Promises Fulfilled. Then proudly, proudly up she rose, though the tear was in her eye. Whate'er ye say, think what ye may, is getting a word from me. Scotch Ballad. It was not merely that Margaret was known to Mr. Thornton to have spoken falsely, though she imagined that for this reason only was she so turned in his opinion, but that this falsehood of hers bore a distinct reference in his mind to some other lover. He could not forget the fond and earnest look that had passed between her and some other man, the attitude of familiar confidence, if not of positive endearment. The thought of this perpetually stung him. It was a picture before his eyes wherever he went and whatever he was doing. In addition to this, and he ground his teeth as he remembered it, was the hour, dusky twilight, the place, so far away from home and comparatively unfrequented. His nobler self had said at first that all this last might be accidental, innocent, justifiable. But once allow her right to love and be beloved, and had he any reason to deny her right? Had not her words been severely explicit when she cast his love away from her? She might easily have been beguiled into a longer walk, on to a later hour than she had anticipated. But that falsehood, which showed a fatal consciousness of something wrong and to be concealed, which was unlike her. He did her that justice, though all the time it would have been a relief to believe her utterly unworthy of his esteem. It was this that made the misery, that he passionately loved her and thought her, even with all her faults, more lovely and more excellent than any other woman. Yet he deemed her so attached to some other man, so led away by her affection for him as to violate her truthful nature. The very falsehood that stained her was a proof how blindly she loved another, this dark, slight, elegant, handsome man, while he himself was rough and stern and strongly made. He lashed himself into an agony of fierce jealousy. He thought of that look, that attitude, how he would have laid his life at her feet for such tender glances, such fond attention. He mocked at himself for having valued the mechanical way in which she had protected him from the fury of the mob, now he had seen how soft and bewitching she looked when with a man she really loved. He remembered, point by point, the sharpness of her words. There was not a man in all that crowd for whom she would not have done as much, far more readily than for him. He shared with the mob in her desire of averting bloodshed from them. But this man, this hidden lover, shared with nobody. He had looks, words, hand-cleavings, lies, concealment, all to himself. Mr. Thornton was conscious that he had never been so irritable as he was now in all his life long. He felt inclined to give a short, abrupt answer, more like a bark than a speech, to everyone that asked him a question. And this consciousness hurt his pride. He had always piqued himself on his self-control, and control himself he would. So the manner was subdued to a quiet deliberation, but the matter was even harder and sterner than common. He was more than usually silent at home, employing his evenings in a continual pace backwards and forwards, which would have annoyed his mother exceedingly if it had been practiced by anyone else, and did not tend to promote any forbearance on her part, even to this beloved son. "Can you stop? Can you sit down for a moment? I have something to say to you, if you would give up that everlasting walk, walk, walk." He sat down instantly on a chair against the wall. "I want to speak to you about Betsy. She says she must leave us, that her lover's death has so affected her spirits she can't give her heart to her work." "Very well. I suppose other cooks are to be met with." "That's so like a man. It's not merely the cooking, it is that she knows all the ways of the house. Besides, she tells me something about your friend Miss Hale." "Miss Hale is no friend of mine. Mr. Hale is my friend." "I'm glad to hear you say so, for if she had been your friend, what Betsy says would have annoyed you." "Let me hear it," said he, with the extreme quietness of manner he had been assuming for the last few days. "Betsy says that the night on which her lover, I forget his name, for she always calls him E. Leonard's. The night on which Leonard's was last seen at the station, when he was last seen on duty, in fact, Miss Hale was there, walking about with a young man who, Betsy believes, killed Leonard's by some blow or push." "Leonard's was not killed by any blow or push." "How do you know?" "Because I distinctly put the question to the surgeon of the infirmary. He told me there was an internal disease of long standing, caused by Leonard's habit of drinking to excess, that the fact of his becoming rapidly worse while in a state of intoxication settled the question as to whether the last fatal attack was caused by excess of drinking or the fall." "The fall? What fall?" "Caused by the blow or push of which Betsy speaks." "Then there was a blow or push?" "I believe so." "And who did it?" "As there was no inquest in consequence of the doctor's opinion, I cannot tell you." "But Miss Hale was there?" No answer. "And with a young man?" Still no answer. At last he said, "I tell you, Mother, that there was no inquest, no inquiry, no judicial inquiry, I mean." "Betsy says that Woolmer, some man she knows who is in a grocer's shop out at Crampton, can swear that Miss Hale was at the station at that hour, walking backwards and forwards with a young man." "I don't see what we have to do with that. Miss Hale is at liberty to please herself." "I'm glad to hear you say so," said Mrs. Thornton eagerly. "It certainly signifies very little to us, not at all to you, after what has passed, but I made a promise to Mrs. Hale that I would not allow her daughter to go wrong without advising and remonstrating with her. I shall certainly let her know my opinion of such conduct." "I do not see any harm in what she did that evening," said Mr. Thornton, getting up and coming near to his mother. He stood by the chimney-piece with his face turned away from the room. "You would not have approved of Fanny's being seen out after dark in a rather lonely place, walking about with a young man. I say nothing of the taste which could choose the time when her mother lay unburied for such a promenade. Should you have liked your sister to have been noticed by a grocer's assistant for doing so? In the first place, as it is not many years since I myself was a draper's assistant, the mere circumstance of a grocer's assistant noticing any act does not alter the character of the act to me. And, in the next place, I see a great deal of difference between Miss Hale and Fanny. I can imagine that the one may have weighty reasons which may and ought to make her overlook any seeming impropriety in her conduct. I never knew Fanny have weighty reasons for anything. Other people must guard her. I believe Miss Hale is a guardian to herself. A pretty character of your sister, indeed. Really, John. One would have thought Miss Hale had done enough to make you clear-sighted. She drew you on to an offer by a bold display of pretended regard for you, to play you off against this very young man, I've no doubt. Her whole conduct is clear to me now. You believe he is her lover, I suppose. You agree to that? He turned round to his mother. His face was very grey and grim. Yes, mother, I do believe he is her lover. When he had spoken, he turned round again. He writhed himself about like one in bodily pain. He leant his face against his hand. Then, before she could speak, he turned sharp again. Mother, he is her lover, whoever he is, but she may need help and womanly counsel. There may be difficulties or temptations which I don't know. I fear there are. I don't want to know what they are, but as you have ever been a good, and a tender mother to me, go to her and gain her confidence and tell her what is best to be done. I know that something is wrong. Some dread must be a terrible torture to her. For God's sake, John, said his mother, now really shocked. What do you mean? What do you mean? What do you know? He did not reply to her. John, I don't know what I shan't think unless you speak. You have no right to say what you've done against her. Not against her, mother. I could not speak against her. Well, you have no right to say what you've done unless you say more. These half-expressions are what ruin a woman's character. Her character? Mother, you do not dare. He faced about and looked into her face with his flaming eyes. Then, drawing himself up into determined composure and dignity, he said, I will not say any more than this, which is neither more nor less than the simple truth, and I am sure you believe me. I have good reason to believe that Miss Hale is in some strait and difficulty connected with an attachment which, of itself, from my knowledge of Miss Hale's character, is perfectly innocent and right. What my reason is I refuse to tell, but never let me hear anyone say a word against her, implying any more serious imputation than that she now needs the counsel of some kind and gentle woman. You promised Mrs. Hale to be that woman. No, said Mrs. Thornton. I am happy to say I did not promise kindness and gentleness, for I felt at the time that it might be out of my power to render these to one of Miss Hale's character and disposition. I promised counsel and advice, such as I would give to my own daughter. I shall speak to her as I would do to Fanny if she had gone gallivanting with a young man at the dusk. I shall speak with relation to the circumstances I know, without being influenced either one way or another by the strong reasons which you will not confide in me. Then I shall have fulfilled my promise and done my duty. She will never bear it, said he passionately. She will have to bear it if I speak in her dead mother's name. Well, said he, breaking away, don't tell me any more about it. I cannot endure to think of it.
It will be better that you should speak to her anyway than that she should not be spoken to at all. Oh, that look of love, continued he between his teeth as he bolted himself into his own private room. And that cursed lie, which showed some terrible shame in the background, to be kept from the light in which I thought she lived perpetually. Oh, Margaret, Margaret, mother, how you have tortured me. Oh, Margaret, could you not have loved me? I am but uncouth and hard, but I would never have led you into any falsehood for me. The more Mrs. Thornton thought over what her son had said in pleading for a merciful judgment for Margaret's indiscretion, the more bitterly she felt inclined towards her. She took a savage pleasure in the idea of speaking her mind to her in the guise of fulfillment of a duty. She enjoyed the thought of showing herself untouched by the glamour which she was well aware Margaret had the power of throwing over many people. She snorted scornfully over the picture of the beauty of her victim, her jet-black hair, her clear, smooth skin, her lucid eyes, would not help to save her one word of the just and stern reproach which Mrs. Thornton spent half the night in preparing to her mind. "Is Miss Hale within?" She knew she was, for she had seen her at the window, and she had her feet inside the little hall before Martha had half answered her question. Margaret was sitting alone, writing to Edith, and giving her many particulars of her mother's last days. It was a softening employment, and she had to brush away the unbidden tears as Mrs. Thornton was announced. She was so gentle and ladylike in her mode of reception that her visitor was somewhat daunted, and it became impossible to utter the speech, so easy of arrangement with no one to address it to. Margaret's low, rich voice was softer than usual, her manner more gracious, because in her heart she was feeling very grateful to Mrs. Thornton for the courteous attention of her call. She exerted herself to find subjects of interest for conversation, praised Martha, the servant whom Mrs. Thornton had found for them, had asked Edith for a little Greek air about which she had spoken to Miss Thornton. Mrs. Thornton was fairly discomfited. Her sharp Damascus blade seemed out of place and useless among rose leaves. She was silent because she was trying to task herself up to her duty. At last she stung herself into its performance by a suspicion which, in spite of all probability, she allowed to cross her mind, that all this sweetness was put on with a view of propitiating Mr. Thornton, that somehow the other attachment had fallen through, and that it suited Miss Hale's purpose to recall her rejected lover. Poor Margaret! There was perhaps so much truth in the suspicion as this, that Mrs. Thornton was the mother of one whose regard she valued and feared to have lost, and this thought unconsciously added to her natural desire of pleasing one who was showing her kindness by her visit. Mrs. Thornton stood up to go, but yet she seemed to have something more to say. She cleared her throat and began, "Miss Hale, I have a duty to perform. I promised your poor mother that, as far as my poor judgment went, I would not allow you to act in any way wrongly or—" She softened her speech down a little here. "Inadvertently, without remonstrating, at least without offering advice, whether you took it or not." Margaret stood before her, blushing like any culprit, with her eyes dilating as she gazed at Mrs. Thornton. She thought she had come to speak to her about the falsehood she had told, that Mr. Thornton had employed her to explain the danger she had exposed herself to of being confuted in full court, and although her heart sank to think he had not rather chosen to come himself and upbraid her and receive her penitence, and restore her again to his good opinion. Yet she was too much humbled not to bear any blame on this subject patiently and meekly. Mrs. Thornton went on. At first, when I heard from one of my servants that you had been seen walking about with a gentleman so far from home as the Outwood station at such a time of the evening, I could hardly believe it. But my son, I'm sorry to say, confirmed our story. It was indiscreet, to say the least. Many a young woman has lost her character before now. Margaret's eyes flashed fire. This was a new idea. This was too insulting. If Mrs. Thornton had spoken to her about the lie she had told, well and good, she would have owned it and humiliated herself. But to interfere with her conduct, to speak of her character, she, Mrs. Thornton, a mere stranger, it was too impertinent. She would not answer her, not one word. Mrs. Thornton saw the battle spirit in Margaret's eyes, and it called up her combativeness also. For your mother's sake, I have thought it right to warn you against such improprieties. They must degrade you in the long run in the estimation of the world, even if, in fact, they do not lead you to positive harm. For my mother's sake, said Margaret in a tearful voice, I will bear much, but I cannot bear everything. She never meant me to be exposed to insult, I'm sure. Insult, Miss Hale? Yes, madam, said Margaret more steadily. It is insult. What do you know of me that should lead you to suspect? Oh, said she, breaking down and covering her face with her hands. I know now. Mr. Thornton has told you. No, Miss Hale, said Mrs. Thornton, her truthfulness causing her to arrest the confession Margaret was on the point of making, though her curiosity was itching to hear it. Stop. Mr. Thornton has told me nothing. You do not know my son. You are not worthy to know him. He said this. Listen, young lady, that you may understand, if you can, what sort of a man you rejected. This Milton manufacturer, his great tender heart scorned as it was scorned, said to me only last night, Go to her. I have good reason to know that she is in some strait arising out of some attachment, and she needs womanly counsel. I believe those were his very words. Farther than that, beyond admitting the fact of your being at the Outwood station with a gentleman on the evening of the 26th, he has said nothing, not one word against you. If he has knowledge of anything which should make you sob so, he keeps it to himself. Margaret's face was still hidden in her hands, the fingers of which were wet with tears. Mrs. Thornton was a little mollified. Come, Miss Hale, there may be circumstances, I'll allow, that, if explained, may take off from the seeming impropriety. Still no answer. Margaret was considering what to say. She wished to stand well with Mrs. Thornton, and yet she could not, might not, give any explanation. Mrs. Thornton grew impatient. I shall be sorry to break off an acquaintance, but for Fanny's sake, as I told my son, if Fanny had done so, we should consider it a great disgrace, and Fanny might be led away. I can give you no explanation, said Margaret in a low voice. I have done wrong, but not in the way you think or know about. I think Mr. Thornton judges me more mercifully than you. She had hard work to keep herself from choking with her tears. But I believe, madam, you mean to do rightly. Thank you, said Mrs. Thornton, drawing herself up. I was not aware that my meaning was doubted. It is the last time I shall interfere. I was unwilling to consent to do it when your mother asked me. I had not approved of my son's attachment to you while I only suspected it. You did not appear to me worthy of him. But when you compromised yourself as you did at the time of the riot and exposed yourself to the comments of servants and workpeople, I felt it was no longer right to set myself against my son's wish of proposing to you, a wish, by the way, which he had always denied entertaining until the day of the riot. Margaret winced and drew in her breath with a long hissing sound, of which, however, Mrs. Thornton took no notice. He came. You had apparently changed your mind. I told my son yesterday that I thought it possible, short as was the interval, you might have heard or learnt something of this other lover.
"What must you think of me, madam?" asked Margaret, throwing her head back with proud disdain till her throat curved outwards like a swan's. "You can say nothing more, Mrs. Thornton. I decline every attempt to justify myself for anything. You must allow me to leave the room." And she swept out of it with the noiseless grace of an offended princess. Mrs. Thornton had quite enough of natural humour to make her feel the ludicrousness of the position in which she was left. There was nothing for it but to show herself out. She was not particularly annoyed at Margaret's way of behaving. She did not care enough for her for that. She had taken Mrs. Thornton's remonstrance to the full as keenly to heart as that lady expected, and Margaret's passion at once mollified her visitor far more than any silence or reserve could have done. It showed the effect of her words. "My young lady," thought Mrs. Thornton to herself, "you've a pretty good temper of your own. If John and you had come together, he would have had to keep a tight hand over you to make you know your place. But I don't think you will go a-walking again with your beau at such an hour of the day in a hurry. You've too much pride and spirit in you for that. I like to see a girl fly out at the notion of being talked about. It shows they're neither giddy nor bold by nature. As for that girl, she might be bold, but she'll never be giddy. I'll do her that justice. Now, as to Fanny, she'd be giddy and not bold. She's no courage in her, poor thing." Mr. Thornton was not spending the morning so satisfactorily as his mother. She, at any rate, was fulfilling her determined purpose. He was trying to understand where he stood, what damage the strike had done him. A good deal of his capital was locked up in new and expensive machinery, and he had also bought cotton largely, with a view to some great orders which he had in hand. The strike had thrown him terribly behindhand as to the completion of these orders. Even with his own accustomed and skilled workpeople, he would have had some difficulty in fulfilling his engagements. As it was, the incompetence of the Irish hands who had to be trained to their work at a time requiring unusual activity was a daily annoyance. It was not a favourable hour for Higgins to make his request. But he had promised Margaret to do it at any cost, so, though every moment added to his repugnance, his pride, and his sullenness of temper, he stood leaning against the dead wall, hour after hour, first on one leg, then on the other. At last the latch was sharply lifted, and out came Mr. Thornton. "I want for to speak to you, sir." "Can't stay now, my man. I'm too late as it is." "Well, sir, I reckon I can wait till you come back." Mr. Thornton was halfway down the street. Higgins sighed, but it was no use. To catch him in the street was his only chance of seeing the master. If he had rung the lodge bell, or even gone up to the house to ask for him, he would have been referred to the overlooker. So he stood still again, vouchsafing no answer but a short nod of recognition to the few men who knew and spoke to him. As the crowd drove out of the mill yard at dinner time,
and scowling with all his might at the Irish knobsticks who had just been imported. At last Mr. Thornton returned. "What? You there still?" "Aye, sir, I mun speak to you." "Come in here, then. Stay, we'll go across the yard. The men are not come back, and we shall have it to ourselves. These good people I see are at dinner," said he, closing the door of the porter's lodge. He stopped to speak to the overlooker. The latter said in a low tone,
"I suppose you know, sir, that the man is Higgins, one of the leaders of the Union. He that made that speech in Hurstfield."
"No, I didn't," said Mr. Thornton, looking round sharply at his follower. Higgins was known to him by name as a turbulent spirit. "Come along," said he, and his tone was rougher than before. "It is men such as this," thought he, "who interrupt commerce and injure the very town they live in, mere demagogues, lovers of power at whatever cost to others." "Well, sir, what do you want with me?" said Mr. Thornton, facing round at him as soon as they were in the counting-house of the mill. "My name is Higgins." "I know that," broke in Mr. Thornton. "What do you want, Mr. Higgins? That's the question." "I want work." "Work? You're a pretty chap to come asking me for work. You don't want impudence, that's very clear." "I've getten enemies and backbiters like my betters, but I ne'er heard any of 'em call me o'er-modest," said Higgins. His blood was a little roused by Mr. Thornton's manner more than by his words. Mr. Thornton saw a letter addressed to himself on the table. He took it up and read it through. At the end he looked up and said, "What are you waiting for?" "An answer to the question I asked." "I gave it you before. Don't waste any more of your time." "You made a remark, sir, on my impudence, but I were taught that it was manners to say either yes or no when I were asked a civil question. I should be thankful to you if you'd give me work. Amper will speak to my being a good hand." "I've a notion you'd better not send me to Amper to ask for a character, my man. I might hear more than you'd like." "I'd take the risk. Worst they could say of me is that I did what I thought best, even to my own wrong." "You'd better go and try them, then, and see whether they'll give you work. I've turned off upwards of 100 of my best hands for no other fault than following you and such as you, and do you think I'll take you on? I might as well put a firebrand into the midst of the cotton waste." Higgins turned away. Then the recollection of Boucher came over him, and he faced round with the greatest concession he could persuade himself to make. "I'd promise you, master, I'd not speak a word as could do harm, if so be you did right by us, and I'd promise more. I'd promise that when I seed you going wrong and acting unfair, I'd speak to you in private first, and that would be a fair warning. If you and I did not agree in our opinion of your conduct, you might turn me off at an hour's notice." "Upon my word, you don't think small beer of yourself. Amper is at a loss of you. How come he to let you and your wisdom go?" "Well, we parted with mutual dissatisfaction. I wouldn't give the pledge they were asking, and they wouldn't have me at no rate. So I'm free to make another engagement, and, as I said before, though I shouldn't say it, I'm a good hand, master, and a steady man, especially when I can keep from drink, and that I shall do now if I never did afore." "That you may have more money laid up for another strike, I suppose." "No, I'd be thankful if I was free to do that. It's for to keep the widow and childer of a man who was drove mad by them knobsticks of yourn, put out of his place by a paddy that didna know weft fra warp." "Well, you'd better turn to something else if you've any such good intention in your head. I shouldn't advise you to stay in Milton. You're too well known here." "If it were summer," said Higgins. I'd take to Paddy's work and go as a navvy or haymaking or summat, and ne'er see Milton again. But it's winter, and the childer will clem. A pretty navvy you'd make. Why, you couldn't do half a day's work at digging against an Irishman. I'd only charge half a day for the 12 hours if I could only do half a day's work in the time. You're not knowing of any place where they could give me a trial away from the mills if I'm such a firebrand. I'd take any wage they thought I was worth for the sake of those childer. Don't you see what you would be? You'd be a nubstick. You'd be taking less wages than the other labourers, all for the sake of another man's children. Think how you'd abuse any poor fellow who was willing to take what he could get to keep his own children. You and your union would soon be down upon him. No, if it's only for the recollection of the way in which you've used the poor knobsticks before now, I say no to your question. I'll not give you work. I won't say I don't believe your pretext for coming and asking for work. I know nothing about it. It may be true, or it may not. It's a very unlikely story, at any rate. Let me pass. I'll not give you work. There's your answer. Here, sir, I would not ha' troubled you, but that I were bid to come by one as seemed to think you'd gotten some soft place in your heart. Her were mistook, and I were misled, but I'm not the first man as is misled by a woman. Tell her to mind her own business the next time, instead of taking up your time and mine too. I believe women are at the bottom of every plague in this world. Be off with you. I'm obliged to you for your kindness, master, and most of all for your civil way of saying goodbye. Mr. Thornton did not deign a reply, but looking out of the window a minute after, he was struck with the lean, bent figure going out of the yard. The heavy walk was in strange contrast with the resolute, clear determination of the man to speak to him. He crossed to the porter's lodge. How long has that man Higgins been waiting to speak to me?
He was outside the gate before 8 o'clock, sir. I think he's been there ever since.
And it is now?
Just 1, sir.
5 hours, thought Mr. Thornton. It's a long time for a man to wait, doing nothing but first hoping and then fearing.
So I mentioned before we listened that this was one of my most frustrating chapters, and I promised you I'd explain why. It's because of how he treats Higgins. I want Thornton to be better than he is. Now, Gaskell was criticized when she wrote this book for having written masters who were too good, too nice. And I'm curious to know if perhaps this chapter was written, since this was written in serial form, which means people were commenting and possibly even reviewing her book as it was being written. It's possible she heard criticism of Mr. Thornton and that this chapter was supposed to in some way rectify that. I don't know that for certain, but I do think that it is not a surprise for a master to treat Higgins the way he did. But for us, it feels like a surprise. For me, it feels like a surprise because I'm so used to kind of taking his side when he's with Margaret. I thought Higgins, however, really ruled this particular chapter. I thought it was fascinating that Thornton said it's a very unlikely story, at any rate, the story about Higgins trying to take care of the widow of Boucher and her children. I thought it was, can he really not know that people starve when there is a strike? Really? I thought that was kind of weird. But then I loved Higgins' parting blow when he said, I'm obliged to you for all of your kindness, master, and most of all, for your civil way of saying goodbye. That was after Thornton said, be off with you. Talk about killing him with kindness. Boy, Higgins comes off looking nice and shiny on this one. But then Mr. Thornton redeems himself because at the end he says, who was that guy? How long was he waiting there? What, the what? And that makes it better because now we know that at least he noticed what Higgins said. He heard Higgins make that snarky comment. And that does make me feel better about Thornton. I was a little worried there. And I think that is where we will leave it for this week. Next week, I will have audio calls to play. They were calls that came in this weekend. So next week, you will hear from more listeners and have a great week. I'll talk to you next week and have more fun stuff then. Take care. Bye. You can find show notes for this episode and links to other episodes at CraftLit.com. CraftLit also appears anywhere you can get a podcast: iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and on, including its own dedicated app. There are lots of ways to support CraftLit, from patreon.com/CraftLit to CraftLit.com memberships and channel memberships on YouTube. You can find out more details at CraftLit.com/premium. And as always, thank you for your support. And remember, if your hands are too busy to pick up a book, at least you can turn one on.